No? Okay. Senator Lytle.
What are your procedures just based off of signal-wise for operating questioning?
Yes. At 20 seconds, you'll get a no card that says 20 seconds. Cool. With that being said, I will go ahead. Yeah, I believe there's another question.
Yeah, I was just wondering what your procedures would be for like taking a point of personal privilege to exit the chamber. How would you like us to conduct that?
Just go ahead and put it in the chat and I'll just grant that to you. One more note for questioning that I missed. I'm going to call on the first speaker and then everybody else just keep your placards up. I'll call on it like consecutively so nobody has to hear my voice again and again. Senator Lytle.
So I know for prelim rounds, they were largely open chambers. Is the semifinals round open as well, or is this a closed chamber?
I believe that one's up to the parley.
Sorry, can you say that again?
So prelim rounds were open. Is the semifinal round an open chamber as well, or is it a closed chamber?
That's actually up to the discretion of the chair. So the PO can decide. It's up to you.
Well, just to make it easy on everybody, let's make it an open chamber. Cool. So with that being said, then I believe we've addressed everything. So hold up, let me just give you the link to my precedents. Parley, can I have the preset precedents, please?
Yes, sorry. Let me find that. Okay, I am privately messaging that to you in the chat, and then you can share with the chamber.
Wonderful. Okay, perfect. Just for everybody, I'm gonna paste that in. And I'm gonna go ahead and put that on my document as well. Cool. So with that being said, I think everything now finally is addressed. So at 10:24 a.m., I call the session into order. Are there any motions? Senator Lytle.
Move to open the floor for docket nominations.
Are there any seconds? Assuming unanimous consent, that motion passes. Any further motions? Senator Beerham.
I move to nominate docket A, consisting of modernized infrastructure, China, asylum, voting.
Are there any seconds? No second.
Oh, I rescind my motion.
No, I believe Senator, there is seconds. Here we go. All right. All those again in favor.
He rescinded the motion beforehand. I was raising for another motion.
Okay, Senator.
I move to propose docket A, which goes China, voting, asylum, modernized infrastructure. Sorry, pardon me. China, modernized infrastructure, asylum, voting.
Okay, cool. Are there any seconds for that one? All right, assuming unanimous consent, that one does pass. Any further motions? Senator Zhang.
Motion to nominate docket B, which consists of China, road, asylum, and voting.
Are there any seconds? Assuming unanimous consent, that does pass. We'll now move to, all right, are there any further motions? Senator Brumbaugh.
Motion to close the floor for docket nominations.
Are there any seconds? Are there any opposed? Seeing none, we'll now move to division of the chamber on voting between the two agendas. So at this time, all those in favor of agenda A, please raise your placard. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. All those against, or rather for agenda B. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So with a vote of 7 to 5 to 0, we will move to agenda A. So with that being said, agenda A consists of China, modernized infrastructure, asylum, and voting, just for everyone's reference. We'll move to debate on China. At this time, are there any authors in the House? Seeing none, any sponsors? Senator Brumbaugh, you have it unopposed.
Thank the chair. Good morning, everyone. That's Senator Brombaugh, spelled BRAHMBHATT. I'm just going to pin my PO, so if you can let me know when all of my judges are ready.
Just note the chamber, as your PO, I'll always be ready, so you don't need to worry about me.
Okay, is everyone good? The Silk Road was the ancient network of trade routes connecting China with the West, where we saw a surge of cultural and religious connectedness and awareness. Now, the Silk Road has expanded to more globalized trade routes than the human mind can fathom. This expansion, however, seems to have blurred our basic values as human beings. The problem is, China has detained the ethnic Uyghur Muslim population at camps in the region of Xinjiang, where allegations of torture, forced labor, and sexual abuse have emerged. Vox in July of 2020 reminds us that expert UN committees have received credible reports that 3 million ethnic Uyghurs in China have disappeared and have been held in re-education camps. But there are several ways that we can tackle the Uyghur crisis. I'm here to prove why my bill is the best way. Primarily, I'd like to preface that China's economy is so intertwined with the world. I will understand the negation's concerns that condemning all trade could be disastrous for the United States. That's why I want to specify that we most likely will not even be imposing this embargo. Cambridge University conducted a meta-analysis dating back to the 20th century on incidents where simply the threat of sanctions was used, and they found that the threat was successful when the cost of compliance was lower than the cost of the sanctions itself. Let's understand Xi Jinping's role in China. He is the reason why China is more integrated into the world economy than ever. His rule has been defined by economic power plays, and honestly, that's all he responds to. China's economy is dependent on two things: inequality growth and heavy reliance on exports from other countries. If we cut off the latter, we devastate the country and therefore severely weaken every effort made by the country in the past 10 years. Jinping knows this, it's his life work. It's his life's work. Taken together, past precedent shows that the warning of sanctions and the threat of a bold economic policy push like this one is enough of a deterrence for China to fix this crisis before we even place the embargo. But let's say that you don't believe me and we have to end up imposing these sanctions on China. I frankly find it appalling that our over-reliance on China is so much of a problem that they could literally genocide people in their country and we would still put the dollar over blatant disrespect for human life, which is why I think we can use my legislation as a way for the United States to establish supply lines in other countries to decrease their reliance. UK-based editorial The New Statesman finds in January of 2021 that China's GDP figures represent real economic activity, but it's not all productive. China's economy is currently unbalanced due to fluctuating levels of consumption and heavy reliance on exports. Last year's growth was made possible by increasing its debt levels. All future impacts from the negation are minimized because China is getting weaker. Their ability to withstand heat from the United States is diminishing, and their lack of transparency in dealings often makes them bad actors. Let's not allow tangled trade routes to obstruct who we are as a people. Pass my bill.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes and 5 seconds. We'll now be moving to 2 minutes of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Lytle.
Yeah, Senator Brombach, so if you state that an embargo in and of itself is not an excellent idea, why not just impose targeted sanctions?
I didn't say that the embargo itself is not an excellent idea. I just said, A, we're probably not going to impose it in the first place, and just the threat of
Okay, so why suggest an embargo if we're not going to actually enforce it?
Because, like I said, the threat of an embargo is enough for them to solve the crisis.
Thank you. We've embargoed China before. Did it work?
We didn't embargo all trade from China.
We've embargoed all trade from China before. Did it actually
Thank you.
succeed?
Senator Metagovic.
Thank you. What are some of the biggest agricultural regions in China?
I'm not sure, you tell me.
Is Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims, one of them?
Sure, I know that it's an important part of their BRI influence.
Sorry for interrupting you, but what happens when an agricultural region can't export because of an embargo?
It's only a single region. I'm sure China has more that they can export from.
But the entire region goes broke. Agriculture relies on exports.
So
why is poverty for the Uyghur Muslims good?
Senator Kong.
Exports presumably.
All right, Senator Barrett, then I believe I'll put your name in the chat.
Thank you. So I just want to bounce off of Senator Lytle's line of questioning. How has China responded when we've introduced economic sanctions in the past?
Well, we haven't introduced such a blanket economic sanction.
Okay, but how have they responded when we have introduced economic sanctions in the past?
Okay, so I do understand that targeted sanctions on certain goods and certain officials have made them more
Has it discouraged them at all when we've introduced economic sanctions in the past?
discourage them how?
Thank you,
Discouraged
Senator.
them from committing human rights abuses.
Yeah, go ahead. Senator Zhang.
Sorry. Hey, Senator. So I understand that the threat of an embargo can be effective, but does this legislation impose the threat of an embargo, or does it just impose an embargo?
Absolutely, this legislation itself is a threat.
Yeah. So if it's directly imposing an embargo, what's the point if what we're trying to go for is just a threat?
I think that's where we're both misunderstanding. This legislation simply, it's up to our discretion to impose this embargo, right? This
Sure, we
legislation
have to impose it at some point, right?
passed it today up till now, till
Thank
June.
you. Question time's elapsed.
But we will have to.
Thank you, Senator. That was a speech.
Point of inquiry.
Go ahead and say that.
Sorry, I just had a question. I know in prelims, the recency chart applied to questioning as well. Is that true here as well, or is that not true?
I stated before that I was going off of randomness for questioning and then establishing recency and then going off of that. That's what I
Okay,
did in the prelims, and that's what was standardized, but yeah. All right, and then one note to the chamber. Like I told you before, I'm going to call the first senator and then the rest in the chat. So it went as we saw Senator Medigovic, Senator Khan, and Senator Zhang. When your name is like in the chat and you like don't have a question, it kind of like ruins the flow. So if your name is in the chat, then just ask the question, I guess. Senator Khan.
A point of inquiry, was my precedence affected because of that? Because what happened was one of my questions I was going to ask was already asked.
No, it's okay. I put Senator
thank you.
because he asked. All right, cool. With that being said, that was a speech in the affirmation. All negation speakers, please rise. Between Senators Khan, Barrett, and Talion, that's going to go to Senator Talion.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber and the PO and of course the judges, that's Senator Talon, Taillon. So I'll just give the judges a minute to get ready. I can see where you guys are. Let me know if you need more time. All right, and I'll begin in a moment. MLK Jr. once said, "Those who do nothing while witnessing injustice do worse than those who commit acts of injustice." And act of injustice is the understatement of today's round when it comes to the atrocities of the Chinese government in Xinjiang. Myself and the rest of the negation agree that we must respond firmly and unequivocally. However, seeing as this proposal is an incredibly irresponsible and ineffective way to do that, as we as Congress take on this issue, our approach must succeed on two fronts: multilateralism and, of course, effectiveness. It is because this piece of legislation fails on both, and because we have far better options available to us, that we fail. So first, Dr. Gary Huffbauer's widely cited study, Economic Sanctions Reconsidered, updated in 2009, looks at a database of over 200 case studies of unilateral US sanctions over 30 years, and finds that they succeed in their aims only 13% of the time. And Senator Brombot, every single one of those cases were against countries far less economically and politically powerful as China. China is not the rest of the world, Senator. If trade sanctions didn't work for Trump, they will not work on a genocide. As Alex Ward of Vox explains in July of 2020, the best way to counter China's actions is to form a powerful international coalition to confront China directly and use multilateral, targeted sanctions designed specifically to disincentivize the continuation of these crimes. According to The Independent in October of 2019, there is a long list of powerful Asian and European countries, such as the UK, Japan, and Germany, that have been limited in their ability to confront this situation because they lack the international backing that a coalition led by the United States would provide. This kind of international cooperation is what the Trump administration refused to do, which proved to the rest of the world that the sanctions that the administration did use were not motivated by sympathy with the Uyghurs, but a broader anti-China strategy. As Dr. C. Gladney of Pomona College here in California explained last year, she is, quote, concerned that once again, the Uyghurs are not being taken seriously in and of themselves, rather than being used as kind of a pawn in a larger geopolitical strategy. As Jessica Tetz, China expert at Middlebury College and editor of the Journal of Chinese Political Science fears, quote, anything the US does on its own will only be read as yet another tactic in its desire to contain China. This bill is simply an escalation of that failing strategy and will be interpreted as such not only by China, but by the global community. It is past time that we set the Trump administration's line aside and work with President Biden to further his major promise of a return to international cooperation on this issue more than ever. But even if we were to assume the efficacy of unilateral sanctions like this bill, the strategy it decides to utilize is one of the least effective and most antagonistic in our toolbox. Right now, we can mandate a ban on imports that use Uyghur slave labor, which, as the New York Times reports, is part of the supply chains for Adidas, Calvin Klein, and more. We also must ban US tech companies from selling China surveillance technology that is used for oppression, and continue to use the Magnitsky Act to specifically punish Chinese leaders without hurting the economy and therefore the Chinese people at large. The reality is, the global community must rally to confront China on this issue. By going it alone in an antagonistic and unhelpfully strategic manner, we will only make the problem worse. Negate.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 10 seconds. We're going for 2 minutes of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Brumbaugh.
So, Senator, how many countries have actually condemned China for their practices in Xinjiang?
I don't have a specific number.
It's like, over 30, right? And a lot of them have imposed sanctions on specific goods, right?
Sure.
Okay, so that's multilateral cooperation to condemn China, right?
Right. It's also not what this bill does. This bill is a very different proposal than what I talked about in my speech.
How effective has that been?
Sanctions without United States cooperation, that's not been effective, no. I think the United States should be cooperating with other countries.
Right now.
Sorry?
How effective has that? Multilateral sanctions. How effective has it?
Senator Nuttall.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first time. You talked in your speech about the failure of unilateral sanctions. However, that evidence was non-specific. What specific evidence do you have that sanctions or embargoes on China would in itself be ineffective?
Well, I don't see why the evidence that I provided wouldn't ascertain to China specifically, since, as I mentioned in my speech, the countries that were cited in that study were a lot less politically powerful than China. On this issue, China has made no signs of yielding, and economic sanctions in the past, right now, they're not working if we do them unilaterally, right? Which is why I talked about international cooperation.
Okay, but you yourself have just said that China's a unique situation.
So a yes or no question, do other democracies also oppose Chinese human rights violations?
Sure.
Yeah, so if they oppose it along with us, why can't they support us with this endeavor?
I'm not saying that they wouldn't support us with this specific endeavor. What I'm pointing out is that when we go this alone, when we take this strong unilateral approach, the message that we're sending isn't oppose the crisis in Xinjiang, right? The message we're sending
Why
is
couldn't
very
the
different.
message be other countries should also impose these sanctions?
Because that wouldn't be the point of providing those sanctions. We should work with the UN to do targeted sanctions, right? So there are multiple reasons
exactly
that I
what
oppose.
we're doing with this legislation.
Senator Beacom.
Hi, Senator. What does Xi Jinping care more about, the Uyghurs or the Chinese economy?
The Chinese economy, but he also cares about being able to back up the specific issue. His message is economic, right? His message is also about spreading Chinese influence across the world. He's been digging their heels in on this issue.
Can I ask another question, Senator? What's the unique difference between sanctions and the embargo?
Well, specific, targeted, intelligence sanctions would focus on this issue. The embargo at large is just an antagonistic approach that harms all of China.
Thank you.
More economic pressure.
Thank you, Senator. Question time's elapsed. That was a speech in negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Between Senators Biram, Nuttall, and Zhang. That's going to go to Senator Zhang.
I thank the chair. Hey, everybody. This is Senator Zhang speaking for the first time today. I'm at the leisure of all. Just a nod, smile, any signal when ready. All right. Oh, just a question for the judges. Is it all right if I time myself? I'll have my phone on silent and everything. All right. Let me get my timer out. In April of 2017, China's government rolled out a list of 29 Muslim names that its citizens were no longer allowed to use. In the 4 years since, it has gone from wiping away names to wiping away people. For all those innocents who stand in a nation where you can be snuffed out just for being who you are, it is imperative that the US no longer look the other way. Stand with me for the innocent across the world and pass. Pass because first, today's policy encourages global participation because it establishes consequences for China's actions. Now, Senator Talon in his speech talks about multilateral cooperation, but he fails to realize that for years, most of the international community has either been silent on Beijing or been silenced by Beijing due to its soft power. Look to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which tells you in January 13th of 2021 that Beijing has constantly used its economic leverage to punish over a dozen countries pursuing policies deemed harmful to China's interests. America, in the status quo, is one of the only nations that is economically equipped to take China on. Here is where his arguments fall apart, because we realize that nothing in this policy prevents multilateral cooperation. As multiple senators have already asked him in questioning, this bill actually establishes the foundation for further cooperation to punish China. With the US leading the charge, it is absolutely imperative that we act now and grant the Uyghur Muslims a voice, because for far too long, they have been both unseen and unheard. Look to the Washington Post, which tells you on February 5th of 2021 that forced sterilization, rape, and torture within China's Uyghur camps is incredibly common, happening on a daily basis. There is no justification for this, senators. We have let the tears of the Uyghur people flow into a vast ocean, and we have done nothing. Their souls are being broken, their spirits crushed, their people exterminated. People are literally dying for our help, senators. Let's give it to them. Pass. But you also pass today because, second, today's policy bolsters American independence because it ends over reliance on Chinese rare earth minerals. So rare earth minerals are a set of 17 minerals critical to the manufacturing of things like missiles, ammunition, and electronic components. Look to the Defense News, which tells you on October 1st of 2020 that the US imports 80% of its rare earth minerals directly from China, and even more is indirectly sourced from the country. We depend on China for their rare earth minerals because they're cheap and easy to get. But these conveniences belie a dark truth. Look to the LA Times, which tells you on July 29th of 2019 that Chinese extraction of rare earth minerals has skyrocketed in the past 2 decades because it had invested in mining and processing while failing to put in proper safeguards. Rare earth mineral spots in China rip apart the communities that they're placed in all too often, creating radiation-soaked villages where residents can't afford to leave. Recognize right now, representatives, our complacency and greed has allowed suffering to fester in the open wounds of this community. Stand with me today. Stand for safety, security, and prosperity, and pass.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 12 seconds. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Lytle.
Yes, Senator Zhang. So you stated specifically about, rare earth mineral mining. So why can't we just targeted sanction that and the security industry instead of embargoing all of China's industry?
Well, again, because we're already economically dependent on China anyways. So this is just one of the benefits of passing.
Right. So the livelihoods of Americans and Chinese individuals rely on the economic partnership. So wouldn't that just destroy a bunch of innocent lives that you're claiming to preserve?
Well, no, America hasn't invested in its own rare earth mineral industry, but we do have one. So just invest more in that in domestic production.
Okay, but that's still...
Thank the chair. So you mentioned earlier, right, about how the U.S. gets 80% of its rare earth minerals from China. Where do they get the rest of their minerals?
I imagine that's from other developing countries or maybe our own production.
Can we go to other developing countries that have less restrictions on environmental impacts? They have less restrictions on who exactly working, like children. So
like I said, again, those impacts do materialize in the status quo anyways, and we can invest in our own domestic mineral production.
Thank you, Senator.
You're welcome.
All right, questioning time has elapsed. That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Between Senators Lytle, Khan, Medigovic, and Barrett, Senator Lytle does have it.
Thank you for recognizing me. This is Senator Lytle, representing the Yellow Rose District of Texas, speaking for the first time this legislative session, and with the knowledge that the President of the Senate is already ready when any of the requisite judges are available. Just give me any sign. Excellent, and excellent. Ancient Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu once said that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And it is because I fundamentally agree with the concept of peaceful resolution that I stand here today in firm negation. Peaceful resolution that specifically provides for the innocence that Senator Zhang claims to support, but his policies directly oppose. We're going to look at 2 specific areas as to why we must fail today's resolution for the purposes of both the United States' and the innocent people of China, including the Uyghurs' interests within the status quo. We're going to look at why you prefer targeted sanctions in the status quo through a bit of historical context, and then why an embargo will cripple the Chinese and Americans alike. So let's look at why we prefer targeted sanctions. As Reuters states on June 3rd of 2021, we can note that the United States of America already embargoed China in the past. Within the 1960s, we put a full embargo on China. Now we're much more reliant on them now. But back in the day when we put that embargo on China, it dramatically negatively affected the people of China without dramatically negatively affecting the government of China. When you put an embargo on a country, you don't just hurt the government, you hurt every innocent civilian within that government. And that very embargo didn't succeed in its political goals. And it's because embargoes aren't proven to work either. Neither sanctions nor embargoes are proven incredibly effective, but as that same article does state, sanctions on China would be much preferable, considering that we could target security industries as well as targeting specific other industries like the rare earth minerals industry that Senator Zhang had mentioned previously. You move for targeted sanctions that don't hurt the people quite as badly. But let's quantify some of those impacts with exactly how this will cripple industries and hurt individuals. As Business Insider states on May 7th of 2018, if you use an iPhone, chances are it was made in China, noting that Foxconn, a Taiwanese electronics manufacturer that employs people in China, employs about 350,000 individuals. By putting that down, first off, you cut off most of United States technological manufacturing, meaning that we have a major shortage. But in addition to that very fact, you put millions of Chinese individuals out of manufacturing business, considering that Statista points out on May 3rd of 2021 that China makes up 30% of all manufacturing worldwide. You bankrupt the individual Chinese people instead of targeting the government that is actually creating this pervasive atrocity within the Uyghur population. But let's also note that from the Brookings Institution on January 6th of 2021, that two specific areas are incredibly important for Chinese imports: semiconductors and soybeans, both massively pervasive within the United States of America. The semiconductor was invented 20 minutes from where I live here in Dallas, Texas. What we have to note is that this will cripple American industry and cripple American farmers and American technological companies. By negating, we avoid both of those and support targeted sanctions that will actually bring about reform to the system. Stand and negate.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 15 seconds. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners, please rise. We'll begin with Senator Khan.
Senator, earlier this year in March, President Biden enacted targeted sanctions on Chinese officials. How did that fare?
It hasn't seen any specific bonus so far, but an embargo would be much worse.
I agree. Embargo would be much worse. But for these sanctions, seeing that they're not working, what else can we do?
Absolutely. So sanctions, as has been previously mentioned, are largely ineffective. The way that you solve the issue is to move in through a UN perspective, specifically to work on crippling the dangerous
So we already
industries
have European
entirely.
allies like
Thank
we
you.
already have European allies.
Hey, Senator, so you talk about working with the UN, right?
Absolutely.
But isn't China on the UN?
China is on the UN, but
Yeah,
most UN
hasn't
members
China
have pushed
worked-
against China so far.
So didn't I mention in my speech that the vast majority of the international community is under China's economic influence?
Absolutely, but that's why you get coordinated efforts to stop that very issue, considering last time we put sanctions on China.
But aren't coordinated efforts already going on in the status quo?
Absolutely not. Most of them are broken and independent.
Okay, so that's not true. The US is already working with Canada and the EU to put targeted sanctions on China.
That was a speech in the negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Between Senators Bieram, Nuttall, and Minnemeyer, Senator Minnemeyer does have it.
I thank the chair. That is Senator Minnemeyer, spelled M-I-N-E-M-I-E-R. This is my first time speaking this legislative session. Judges, just give me some indication if you're not ready. Yes, Senator. Oh, sorry.
No, Senator.
I had a quick point of inquiry.
Yeah.
So for the PO, I noted on my timer I only had 310, but you stated 315 afterwards when you gave me the fist. I was a little bit confused by that one.
I mean, my timer said 315.
Okay.
Even then, I mean, no penalty should have happened, so I guess I'm not sure. I think you're good, Senator Minmeyer, to go.
Okay, perfect. You walk into a Walmart and what do you see? All kinds of products, all at low prices, all made in China, demonstrating China's massive economic and political hold on the United States. And that seems to be one of the negation's primary concerns regarding today's embargo. However, let's frame today's debate. Let's examine the two possible scenarios in the affirmation world and realize that both are an inherent step up from the status quo. So the first scenario, if China stops, not only do we save the lives of so many Uyghurs, Senator Zhang, we also correct past American wrongs. This is because our very actions have encouraged the abuse in China. According to Masood Haoyun of Pacific Standard in September of 2018, the United States has played and is playing a major role in inspiring overwhelming human rights violations overseas, including China's oppression of the Uyghurs. Amid President Bush's war on terror, China began to report the existence of a Uyghur separatist group called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, leading to the situation the Uyghurs find themselves in today. Senators, the bottom line is that the US had a role in the origins of this struggle. When we, so caught up with the developments of the West, overlooked a horrific abuse of international law and basic humanity. It's time we start paying attention and step up for those held down by President Xi and his administration. But now, the second scenario, the scenario where we hold the negation at their highest ground and China doesn't stop their abuses. Let's understand that an American economy with China out of the picture isn't as bad as the negation paints it. Senator Brombach already proves that the US can look to diversification when we cut off China, and that's amazing. But let's also examine the affirmation world from a worker standpoint. Because Senator Lytle, you're so concerned about manufacturing jobs lost in China when we pass. But let's understand why that is inherently a good thing for workers, both at home and abroad. Let's turn to the far overseas and look at labor in China first. According to CNBC in 2018, Chinese factory workers producing toys for Hasbro and Disney are already being subjected to nightmare working conditions. This includes workers subjected to 139 hours of overtime a month over the legal limit and the handling of toxic, cancerous chemicals on a regular basis. And consider that this report is just one of the horror stories coming out of Chinese sweatshops, which now require nets off the side to stop workers from committing suicide. Senator Lytle, you argue that when we pass, we harm workers in China, but the harm is already there in the status quo when their companies exploit workers to make a pretty penny. That is not the American way. And when we pass, those jobs are eliminated, you're right, but guess where they go? They return back to the United States. According to American Manufacturing in 2020, workers saw 3.7 million US jobs lost to China since 2001, and this number is only growing as Chinese labor remains cheap. In the affirmation world, we keep the manufacturing jobs at home and prevent them from the horrible working conditions overseas. The reason companies go to China is that they find our laws, our constitution inconvenient. But American jobs aren't inconvenient. Worker liberties aren't inconvenient, and human rights aren't inconvenient. Side with me and affirm.
Thank you, Senator. Speech time, 3 minutes, 9 seconds. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Medigovic.
An embargo would probably make things more expensive, right?
In terms of what specifically?
Everything.
Like products, you're saying?
Yes.
Labor would be definitely more expensive because it would be, I mean, it would be at home for companies.
Great point. How do you combat more expensive supply for labor?
I think that returning manufacturing to America is inherently a step up from cheap labor going to China. So we're going to prevent that anyway.
If labor gets more expensive, don't you just outsource it?
Okay, so outsourcing could still happen, but at least it won't be to China, and they're the main outsourcers.
Thank you. Just bouncing off that previous line of questioning, why do you assume that jobs come to America instead of us just like buying from some other country?
Okay, you're right. So I should have said that. The jobs either return to America, we've lost so many to China, or they're going to go to other countries where labor still remains relatively cheap. The problem is they don't have these manufacturing jobs in these other countries like they do in China.
But they also have less restrictions than China does on employment rights, don't they?
Yeah.
They're cheaper countries.
No, not less than China. China is literally the worst in terms
but if it's the same impact of China, how is your argument unique? If they still have bad employment regulations?
We're going to see some jobs come back.
That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Between Senators Barrett, Medigovic, and Lotto. That's going to go to Senator Lotto.
Mr. Chair, I'm Senator Omema Ledoux from the Nebraska District. This will be my first time speaking this session, and I'll take silence as an indication that all of my judges are ready. And I'll pull up a timer. The genocide of the Uyghur people is one that cannot be understated. Neither is a response to these acts. But passing this bill is not the answer. I stand in firm negation of this legislation because first, sanctions have already been put on China, and second, an embargo on trade will only hurt the most vulnerable populations. To begin, Senator Taiwan gives you a brilliant example of a multilateral approach and how it's best, and I'd like to expand on that. Under the Magnitsky Act, the Biden administration was already able to impose sanctions. An article from the Washington Post posted on March 22nd of this year reports that the US placed sanctions on the top Chinese officials as a part of multinational efforts to punish Beijing for human rights abuses against the largely Muslim Uyghur minority group, which American officials have called a genocide. The US reiterates its call on the PRC to bring an end to the repression of Uyghurs who are predominantly Muslim and the members of ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang, including by releasing all of the arbitrarily held in internment camps and detention facilities. Unprecedented cooperation between governments like this is how a genocide will be brought to an end. That article quotes Omar Kanat, who was the executive director of the Human Rights Project. This is what Uyghurs have been asking for. The dam has been broken and the response has finally begun. Just like Kanat, I believe that a multilateral approach to China is much better than the unilateral one proposed by this bill. Now let's examine why an embargo on trade is dangerous. The National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association of America explained in 2006 that when a country cannot invade them, the US trade sanctions have done disastrous effects on civilians while having little effect on the targeted country's government policy. A US embargo narrows the opportunity of private individuals for economic, social, and cultural contacts with American citizens and can often critically undermine the health and well-being of that country's population. An embargo damage to the country's population can produce undesired change, providing justification for the targeted government anti-US policies. While there are some exemptions, overall US embargoes are not effective in promoting meaningful foreign policy changes and are frequently counterproductive. Putting this in context of China, it's much worse. Senator Lotto gives you a great example, a past embargo on China that hurt the people the most. But by passing this bill, that same impact will materialize in the status quo. An embargo may seem like the best solution to this problem. However, past precedent shows that that is not true. And Representative Brombach, they may try to tell you that embargo will not happen, but the bill imposes an embargo, so none of our impacts materialize. With that being said, I stand in firm negation of this bill because targeted sanctions are already working in the status quo, and targeted embargoes hurt all. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Speech time, 2 minutes, 40 seconds. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners, please rise. We'll begin with Senator Minnemeyer.
Okay, so you talk about how an embargo won't work, and you bring up that embargo from the 1960s again. But today, our economy is very different. We're very intertwined with China, right? So we haven't tried an embargo as big as this, have we?
Yeah, we haven't tried an embargo as big as this, and it'll have even more disastrous effects, I would contend, since we rely so heavily on labor from China and their exports.
But we've already talked about diversification and employment and how that's possible to avoid from the U.S. standpoint.
Materialize, which will make things worse for people.
Senator Brombach.
This bill goes into effect January 2022, right? Yeah. Okay, so it's June. If we pass this bill right now, isn't that the warning to China to help this Uyghur crisis? And then later, if they don't, in January 2022, we impose the embargo, right?
I would contend that the targeted sanctions that we already have with the US, with the EU and Canada will probably begin to work within that time.
Know that
plus it also does impose sanctions.
How has that ever been a push enough for China to stop?
That was a speech in the negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Between Senators Biram, Dilip Kumar, and Nuttall, that's going to go to Senator Biram.
Hi everyone, that's Senator Biram, spelled B-E-E-R-A-M. I'm at the leisure of all, so just any verbal indication if any of my judges are not ready. Awesome, I'll get started. Albert Einstein once said, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who see evil and do nothing." It's ironic to me that the words of a 20th century scientist ring more empathetic than the words of this Congress. You don't have to split the atom to understand that our policy can no longer be defined by fear when millions are being abused. take action, pass this legislation. I want to recontextualize this round because I feel that Senator Brombat and Zhang didn't actually show you the full picture of our leverage over China right now, because the embargo is our primary leverage. Let's take a cue from Albert Einstein and take a scientific approach to finally prove why embargoes are uniquely needed over targeted sanctions. First, I'll start with our observations. Senator Talon and Lytle on the negation have told you that China isn't reliant on us, but it seems everyone so far has missed one major blind spot: manufacturing. The US Trade Representative found that right now, we are China's favorite manufacturing customer, with our purchases funding over 30% of their industry. Here's what's really important. We don't just control 30% of their industry, we control nearly 100%. Why is that? If there is an embargo, every company located in China that uses their manufacturing can no longer sell products in our marketplace. Senator Barrett and Lytle, that doesn't happen with sanctions because under sanctions, they can still sell them. An embargo uniquely forces companies to make a choice. Either keep manufacturing inside China and lose our marketplace entirely, or move manufacturing out of China and have access to both marketplaces. Senator Medigovic, that outsourcing impacts China predominantly. The Nikkei Asian Business Review found in April of 2019 that companies will want to continue accessing the American consumer base. That's why international companies are pressured to move out of China. Everyone has talked about the power of China and why it should be feared, but have failed to recognize the power in this very room. So what does that mean in the context of today's debate? We force them to comply. Financial firm FinPix explains in April of this year that 37% of China's entire economy is based on manufacturing. So finally, let's ask, why does our control over manufacturing force China into compliance? The Peterson Institute for International Economics found that without manufacturing, China cannot continue their expensive foreign policy like the Belt and Road Initiative. China won't risk 37% of their economy and their entire political future. Senator Talon, you conceded to me during questioning that China cares more about its economy than Uyghurs. This is why you pass. This is also why all of the impacts Senator Brombat gives you actually materialize. It doesn't take a scientist to understand that apathy towards evil is just as wrong as evil itself. It's time for action. It's time to pass.
Thank you, Senator. Speech time, 3 minutes, 1 second. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Talon.
Thank you. Senator, if I cited several excerpts in my speech explaining how unilateral sanctions of this type would be not targeted on Xinjiang, would be internationally interpreted as nothing more than geopolitical strategizing, why is it not better than passing this bill to go to other countries, and if you want to focus on manufacturing, focus on manufacturing?
Yeah, sure, because with sanctions, Chinese companies can still sell to the US. An embargo uniquely means that companies have to choose. It's either the US or China. Since they have a large...
Okay, but what you said in your speech is that they have to choose between the Uyghurs and their manufacturing, right? But if this is not going to be interpreted about the Uyghurs, how does that solve it?
Senator, so you talk about one way the United States has leverage over China, but doesn't that go both ways? Like China has leverage over the United States in many other ways, right?
Not necessarily, because China gives us a lot of exports, but we don't send as many imports to China as they send exports to us.
Okay, so if I can prove to you that there are other forms of leverage that China might have over us that are more pressing,
but
then wouldn't that mean...
China's not going to sacrifice 37% of their economy for the Uyghurs. They're going to capitulate to our demands.
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed.
I thank the chair.
That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Between Senators Barrett, Medigovic, and Khan. That's going to go to Senator Medigovic.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. That's Senator Medigovic. By any chance, is anyone not ready? Great to see. I'll be happy to get started then. America's sheer existence has made wakes in the seas of liberty. Because until we came about, hope for the most marginalized across the globe wasn't even visible. Ultimately, though, we failed today's legislation to make sure we don't backpedal on our pledge of making the world a freer place. First, I want to answer this question of how worthwhile these tariffs are, since the affirmation is very quick to cast aside our economy. On the American side, they hurt really bad. In fact, Senator Manimar and Biram George Mason University in 2018 says that tariffs will increase prices by 10% and outsource 20,000 jobs, since China will probably return the favor when we do that to them. The real problems start, though, when you start to see what outsourcing really looks like. According to the Norwegian University of Science in 2014, a quarter of these jobs are worked by children, where every 10% increase in child labor increases the amount of child deaths by 50 per 1,000 births. Don't take a moral high ground when you represent the morally bankrupt. Secondarily, I'd like to make the case that this bill is the absolute worst thing you could do for the Uyghurs. Here's why. Economic pressure has been raising regional poverty. It's not like the world is blind to this crisis. For months now, the United States has sanctioned China over this. In fact, according to the New York Times last July, the US is sanctioning of critical Xinjiang development companies over the Uyghur Muslims cost the region over $43 million. The problem Senator Nuttall asks for is that their internment camp operations have increased at a higher rate than ever before because of the regional poverty and internal tensions this is causing. Something it feels like we're all conveniently forgetting is that poor conditions make tensions skyrocket. Not only has China not budged on their stance regarding their re-education camps, even in light of sanctions like Senator Lytle told you, making it unclear as to why these would be any different, but a world in which we further impoverish Xinjiang by subjecting them to an entire embargo is one doomed to conflict. I asked Senator Brumba in the beginning about where the biggest agricultural regions that export a lot in China are, because the answer is Xinjiang. You're targeting exactly who you want to help. AP News last July explains that because of Xinjiang's status as an agricultural region, if they don't export, everyone goes broke. In particular, sanctions that have prevented them from selling products have caused Chinese Uyghur tensions to rise rapidly as poverty is catalyzing historical xenophobia. Senator Zhang, you're giving people who already hate each other even more motive to act when their livelihoods are endangered after losing their jobs because our embargo deterred customers. At this point, there should be no surprise that these sectarian conflicts increase Uyghur abuse. When xenophobia is exacerbated, ethnic conflicts happen more frequently, giving the Chinese government more warrant to basically imprison people in re-education camps. In fact, Georgetown University in 2019 cited that ethnic conflicts in Xinjiang have left over 200 Uyghurs dead and 7,900 arrested after clashing with Chinese troops. Most ironically, the same efforts that were supposed to oppose China's usage of these camps ultimately increased the amount of people in them to 3 million because of these conflicts. Don't let naive optimism be what seals the fate of a struggling people. Thank you.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 15 seconds exactly. We'll now move to 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Biram.
Hi, Senator. So if I already proved to you that corporations leave China if they don't comply, then why is outsourcing not a positive impact?
China is not like, they're not going to not return the favor. If we embargo China, they're probably going to also place tariffs on us, if not an entire embargo of their own.
So who's running the trade surplus, us or China?
I don't know exactly, but at the end of the day, if we embargo each other, both countries are wrecked.
Yeah, it's us. So why is China not uniquely hurt from that?
Both countries are harmed. None of this is worth it, especially when you can't even help the target demographic that you're trying to save.
So you claim that Xinjiang is going to be devastated because it's an agricultural region that exports to the US, right? But doesn't the agricultural market center around hunger and world hunger?
It does, but they also export a lot to the United States.
So when the US loses an importer of agriculture, they turn elsewhere and somebody else needs that import from somebody. So there's one undifferentiated market for global agriculture. That region will be fine. They'll still be able to export their goods to other places.
This isn't representative of Xinjiang. They're already struggling as an agriculture region.
Thank you, senators. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Senator Dilip Kumar, you have it.
Thank the chair. Hi, everybody. That's Senator Dilip Kumar. I'm just going to wait 5 seconds. If you're not ready, please let me know. Looks like everybody's good. Perfect. The giant Tian Shan mountain range in China is known for its beautiful and natural landscape. But behind this beauty lies a dark shadow, where countless Uyghurs are being oppressed at the hands of the Chinese government. This is our chance to help the Uyghurs climb to prosperity. Let's ask the most fundamental question in today's debate. what happens to Chinese human rights violations under this legislation. It's time this debate stops focusing on the hypotheticals of what might happen and starts focusing on the empirics of what has. Let me once and for all end this debate in favor of the affirmation. Look to the IMF in July 2019 when they explained that US economic growth during the last trade war jumped by 13% and Chinese economic growth declined by 2%. Senator Brombach already told you why that happens. China's export reliance makes it vulnerable to external pressures. So ultimately, there are two possibilities when we pass this legislation. Let me explain why in either world, the affirmation wins. First, China responds to US sanctions by decreasing human rights violations. Senator Little asked in questioning whether past economic threats have worked. Let me explain exactly why they have. Guardian explains on September 18th, 2020, that after the US threatened to reduce imports from China, China reversed decades of oppressive policy, including being more transparent about their human rights abuses. Senator Talon cites the 13% of US sanctions that have worked in the past, but understand that China is more susceptible to unilateral sanctions than the average country. Because of their export-based economy. Our sanctions have worked in the past, and our embargo will work today. And Senator Medigovic, your argument on the effects of Uyghurs under this legislation is entirely non-unique, since we've already sanctioned those imports from the Xinjiang region. Ultimately, what we do with this legislation is show China and show the world that human rights violations will not be tolerated by the United States. But second, let's take the negation at their highest ground. Even if China refuses to back down in their human rights violations, we still give the US a comparative economic advantage. Senators Brombach, Biram, and Minnemeyer already told you the positive effects of an American economy free of China thanks to decreased Chinese manufacturing. Let me terminalize the effect of increased American manufacturing on our most vulnerable constituents. So why will manufacturing come back to the US? It's because companies want to avoid trade volatility. And the best way to do that is to manufacture in the country you're selling in. That's the United States. So what happens to those jobs? The Brookings Institute explains on May 1st, 2018, that manufacturing jobs are disproportionately held by low-wage workers. Those are the constituents you help by this legislation. So ultimately, we either end human rights abuses or help everyday Americans struggling in the status quo. No matter how brutal the fall is, any mountain is scalable if there is a path. Pass today to be that path to safety, prosperity, and above all, humanity.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 8 seconds. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Talon.
Thank you. Senator, if companies want to keep manufacturing in the United States for the reasons you mentioned, why over the past 30 years have almost all of those jobs went overseas?
It's because our trade policy in the past has been very open, right? So it's not very hard for companies to move from China back to the United States.
Right, but like not looking at China, the rest of the world is still pretty open with the United States, right?
Right. Increased U.S.-China trade volatility also means increased.
Right. So why would those jobs that we know because they did it had an incentive to go overseas simply move from China to elsewhere, Malaysia, these other countries?
On a global scale, not just China.
Yes, Senator Dilip Kumar, is reducing imports in a minor fashion in any way comparable to a full embargo?
I would say that the embargo would have an even better effect if the imports themselves had a good
effect. But it'll wreck the Chinese manufacturing sector, so you're putting millions of people out of work. How is that in any way ethical?
Because we're bringing those jobs back to the United States.
Okay, so it's okay to ruin people's lives as long as they're not Americans.
We're not ruining their lives in the first place, right? We already showed you why those human rights violations are ended. We won't even have to enforce.
So they're going to starve instead of being paid less.
They're going to solve their problem.
Time's elapsed. Thank you, senators. That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Between Senators Khan and Barrett, that's going to go to Senator Khan.
I thank the chair. And as always, any indication, one of my judges already, that would be great. One of my staffers recently informed me that China had banned the letter N. So I'm not going to tell you to fail. I'm going to tell you negate. On a more serious note, if there's one thing you take away from today's debate, it's that there are other solutions to hold China accountable. But the consequences of an embargo even if it's just threatening one, are just way too extreme. The first are the effects of escalation. So even if you buy Senator Braunbach's unique idea that the embargo is just a threat, which everyone coincidentally forgot, escalation is still a valid consequence. For a topic as ever-changing as foreign relations, it's important to evaluate escalation through the lens of the most current context. That's why you realize that most other analyses on foreign relations given today are simply outdated. So let's do that. Max Baucus, a former US ambassador to China, 2 days ago explained, our relations in the past few days are deteriorating with China. Biden simply hasn't eased the trade war tariffs as China expected, and that economic harm isn't going over well in China. So tariffs aren't dealt with well, as Senator Medigovich thankfully spent the time to elaborate the consequences of those tariffs. So the question must be asked, what would be the consequences if we passed an embargo, kind of like this legislation? And the answer to that is really, really hard to find. You have to go back 6 months? The South China Morning Post explains that the fallout over China's imperialism in the South China Sea at the end of 2020 was so tense that it had scares of World War III. Nuclear proliferation was very heavy. Both sides were fully armed and prepared at any moment. I'm not kidding, but if there's one piece of legislation in my entire life as a legislator that has the most destructive potential, this bill is it. But maybe war doesn't scare you. Here's what will. Chinese IP theft. The only thing keeping China from engaging in the most rigorous form of IP theft is the fact that we manufacture specific goods that China needs from us, which is our leverage, exactly like Senator Biron tells you. You take away that leverage and you give no incentive for the Chinese government to control IP theft, something that unfortunately Senator Biron outweighs our leverage. Foreign Policy explains in 2019 that Chinese IP theft has cost the United States $225 billion to $600 billion a year. But enough hypotheticals. Let's take Senator Zhang's interpretation of us actually going through with the embargo, and we'll see that immediate impact of hundreds of billions that almost every negative speaker talks about is also something to worry about. You're probably thinking, great, another economic impact. But for the future of today's debate, when compared to other impacts, you may not care so much about money. And to be honest, I don't care that much about money too. Don't tell that to my lobbyists. But it's about the health of our country. When you impact our economy at such large scales, losing the biggest trading partner in the world means that effect ripples. And that's what most of the affirmation and Senator Minamar gets wrong. He and the rest of the affirmation don't account for the ripple effect because it's really hard to measure. Without a doubt, every single American's life would significantly change if you pass an embargo, ranging from the stock market crashes to putting millions around the world in poverty to the shutdown of all businesses. I'm not exaggerating. Keep our relationship with China. Gate.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 9 seconds. We're allowing for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Dilip Kumar.
If the economic effects of an embargo are so bad to China, why would they let that happen in the first place?
Okay, so I went through both interpretations. My first one focused more on the escalation and the fact that we're using it as a threat. So that we'll go to that part of my speech.
Yeah, but why would they escalate in the first place instead of just ending those human rights violations?
No, you're expecting that something happens, right? When you pass or threaten an embargo, either escalation happens or they change. I'm saying escalation is definitely going to happen because
why would they not change? Why would they not change their domestic policy?
Thank you.
No, they're not going to change.
Hey, so let's clarify something about your point about IP theft. You yourself said that IP theft is already occurring in the status quo, right?
Sure, it is. But here's the
thing.
Right.
So how is that a unique harm of passing this policy?
No, so what we do right now is we control most of it by leveraging exactly what Senator Biron said.
We still lose hundreds of billions of dollars to it, right?
We have specific economic
is there proof that our leverage over China has lessened IP theft?
Yes, we have negotiated to lessen IP theft with China in the past.
Okay, but it's still happening though, right?
Right, but at a lesser
scale. So how does
scale.
passing make this situation worse?
Thank you.
I'm saying it has the potential to be.
That was a speech in the negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Senator Nuttall, you have it unopposed.
I thank the chair, and I'll just have a thumbs up for my judges when they are ready. Excellent, that does look like everybody. When debating about geopolitical policy, it seems like so often we are so quick to move to chess metaphors. However, I would like to strike a slightly different tone with the beloved Chinese game of Mahjong, a tile game where one must keep their eyes peeled, ready to grab a tile whenever it comes, in order to form 4 suits that you need to ultimately win the game. Like Mahjong, this piece of legislation keeps its eyes peeled, ready to grab any tile in its place, to form a multilateral rather than unilateral foreign policy to form strong suits, strong as armor rather than simply tiles, which is why I urge you to affirm. Now, firstly, I would like to crystallize this debate along two key questions that this debate revolves around. Firstly, do we bring in other countries? And secondly, do we effectively reduce human rights abuses in China? But firstly, do we bring in other countries? It seems like it's been a major misconception throughout this debate that we have a unilateral foreign policy under this legislation, and that that's proven detrimental. However, I would like to distance myself from speakers on both sides of the flow because we actually do bring in other countries with this piece of legislation. Senators Tayan and Senator Ledoux, you have championed a multilateral approach, and I absolutely agree. And I'd like to distance myself from Senator Dilip Kumar in this debate, who's talked about how unilateral approaches are more effective. Senator Zhang, you attempted to make the argument in this debate that China has silenced other countries. However, you provided no evidence that we bring in other countries. Allow me to finally fill in that missing link. This is because this piece of legislation specifically uses the word genocide. As Section 1 of this legislation says, quote, an embargo shall be placed on all trade with China until they cease their, quote, genocidal action against the Uyghur people of Xinjiang. Why is this important? According to the Cato Institute, in 2017, labeling a crisis ethnic cleansing has no legal implications, but if you label something a genocide, then authorities would come under the authority of the International Criminal Court, a special court that investigates and prosecutes crimes, war crimes, as well as genocide. So we bring China's authorities specifically under this authority and make it so that the cries of the Uyghurs are no longer silenced as they're huddled into tighter and tighter quarters and camps. But secondly, now that I've proven that we in fact have a multilateral approach with this piece of legislation, let's talk about how we do in fact effectively reduce tensions as well as human rights abuses. Brookings tells us in January of 2021 that Chinese leaders measure the seriousness of American foreign policy in part based on whether it appears enduring or transitory. The more Chinese policy reflects the views of the American public and aligns with the approach of America's allies, the harder it is for Beijing to weigh out pressure and avoid adjustments to its own behavior. We bring in those adjustments. Senator Biram, you talked about the pressure we put on China. However, I will talk specifically about how we bring in those decision changes. In Mahjong, you must keep your eyes peeled, ready to grab any tile wherever it is. And let's grab the tiles that keep human rights abuses out of China.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 13 seconds. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Ledoux.
I thank the chair. So could you name any other countries that have considered putting an embargo on all trades to China?
No, I could not name those specific countries.
Well, that's because not all countries are considering a trade embargo on China, right? We're working with the EU, we're working with the UK to enact targeted sanctions. So why would we change that?
We would change that because it's effective. As I talked about in the Brookings Institution, the key part of our policy with China is whether it appears enduring or transitory, and an embargo would do just that.
Thank you. Senator Barrett.
Hi, Senator. So why does the mere presence of China in the International Criminal Court automatically secure multilateralism?
It automatically secures multilateralism because the International Court is an international entity, and as the court's website itself says, it relies on cooperation with other countries worldwide for support.
Sure, it relies on cooperation. What says they're going to get it?
What do you mean?
How can we ensure that they're going to get multilateralism? Like, of course they rely on it. How are they going to get it?
We're going to get it specifically because...
Thank you, senators. Those who speak in the affirmation, negative speakers, please rise. Senator Barrett, you have it unopposed.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Senator Barrett. It's spelled B-A-R-R-E-T-T. Speaking on the negation of today's legislation, a little later in the round than I'd like to, but happy to be speaking nevertheless. I'm at the leisure of my judges and PO. Any indication when you guys are ready? Awesome. From bodies buried in Beijing to killings in Karachi, there is conflict all over this world. And if you ask your constituency, insulated in the borders of freedom, they wouldn't know where to start. The Uyghurs don't have that privilege, the bliss of ignorance. Not when gunmen knock on their doors to slaughter them, their family, and their people. This isn't the path to peace, it's the way to wrath. Fail today's legislation. Let me settle the biggest question in today's debate, which is whether or not this embargo will work. Let me explain why it unequivocally will not and instead actually helps China. The New York Times reports on October 18th of 2020, the Chinese economy surged 4.9% after the pandemic. The robust performance brings China almost back up to the roughly 6% pace of growth that it was reporting before the pandemic. China's economy is literally growing in the status quo, making them increasingly resilient to American embargoes. We bolster this resiliency when we pass today's legislation. Look to historical precedents. Senator Lytle tells you that the embargo in the 60s didn't work. Let me explain to you why and emphasize how it actually helped them. Zhenju Shen of the American Association for Chinese Studies wrote in October of 2006 that China's GDP and foreign trade expanded steadily and impressively in spite of a US trade embargo. That's because China was able to manipulate discord between the US, its European allies, and Japan, from which Beijing acquired practically everything the US wanted to deny it. By developing trade with American allies, China rendered completely ineffective the embargo that was designed to curtail China's economic growth. Senator Zhang, you're right. China is really good at manipulating allies. That's exactly why multilateralism isn't likely and hasn't worked historically. And Senator Dilip Kumar, if an embargo actually increased China's GDP at the US's expense, that doesn't sound very effective. So ultimately, it becomes a game of chicken. China's economy continues to grow while ours is absolutely crushed. It's clear who's getting cooked. But everyone tells you that this embargo hurts people. Let's specifically look at the impacts of the people that we're trying to help, the Uyghurs. Chad Clay, associate professor with the School of Public Affairs at the University of Georgia, explains in 2018 that the imposition of economic sanctions is regularly followed by increases in the use of torture, killings, and political imprisonment, often enforced disappearance by China, even when sanctions are imposed over human rights violations. Senator Brombit, the negation isn't concerned about the cost of money. We're concerned about the cost of lives. Imposing sanctions has consistently led to even greater abuses, which completely undermines the purpose of today's legislation. Senator Medigovic, it's not just about poverty. We subject Uyghurs to even more abuses with today's legislation. Protect the people that you promised you would protect and fail today's bill.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 1 second. We're in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Khan.
Good morning, Senator.
Hi, I'm confused. Why are Uyghurs more hurt if we fail?
Right. Consistently, when we implement sanctions against countries, Senator Medigovic touched on this, it actually increases tensions between the government and the people. That's because the people are have even more civil discontent when they're harmed by the sanctions we impose, which increases tensions, which
So you're saying the only reason they're abusing the Uyghur people is because of civil discontent? Like their government is just angry at other governments, so they abuse Uyghur people?
No, it's ultimately a combination of multiple different tensions from both sides. We exacerbate those tensions under today's bill.
So who has greater imports, the US or China?
I think it's the US.
Right. So if the US has greater imports, why would China's economy be benefited on net from a trade embargo?
I showed you historically China's economy benefits with an embargo because they use other different countries and they use manipulation to ensure that they get what they need from those other different countries. That's
right.
What happens.
But in that case, we're doing trade with those other countries and not China directly, right? Doesn't that still hurt their manufacturing base?
No, because they're just trading with other countries. They're replacing us.
Thank you, senators. Is there a motion on the floor? Senator Zhang.
Move the previous question.
Are there any seconds? Are there any opposed? Seeing none, we'll move to previous question. All those who wish to pass this item concerning an embargo on China, please raise your placard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6. All those who wish to fail this legislation, please raise your placard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'll break the tie with a vote of 7 to 6 0. This legislation does pass. Are there any further motions on the floor? Senator Lytle.
Seeing a natural break in debate, I move for a 10-minute recess.
Are there any seconds? Are there any opposed? Seeing none, be back here at 11:41.
So y'all good with me sponsoring?
I can go first, Mag.
Also, Senator Khan, you kind of sound like Lin-Manuel Miranda, and that's really dope.
All right, everyone, it is 11:40. Let's start slowly coming back to the chamber so we can get started in about a minute. We're just waiting on Senators Lotto, Prombot, and our other two judges had their cameras off for a little bit, so just want to make sure. Senators Lotto and Brombot, or Ledoux and Brombot. The Senator Brombot.
Mr. President, can I ask you if the following semi-session does like this preset recency reset, or like is it carrying over like a part 2 or something?
I believe it does reset.
Okay, cool.
Just a quick question for the PO.
Yeah.
So do you count down the grace period? Because I've noticed that before, like even before you like reach the fist, we will have gone over 3 minutes and 10 seconds.
Yeah, it's like 3:05, and then just because like
so you start the countdown at 3:05.
Yeah, counting down from 3:05 up until 3:15.
Okay.
The grace period for NSDA is 3:10, though, right?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Okay, I mean, to my knowledge, everybody has told me that it's been 3:15. We can.
If it's 3:15, then okay.
That's just what we've been operating.
Does the parley have anything?
Does the parley know?
Yeah.
Is it different?
I can double check. I feel like at this point, unless anyone has any strong objections, if we've been operating on a 15-second grace period, we should continue that just so everybody is on the same page.
Okay, because yeah.
All right.
But I mean, we can also, when we swap out sessions, we can revert back to 10 seconds, but I will double check on the official rules.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm more than fine
Thank
with
you.
3:15. Yeah.
That works.
That's what I don't know. I just feel like it's more of a convenience to the competitors for like that 15-second. But
sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, if you don't want extra time, that's not a problem. All right. It seems that everybody is back. So assuming everybody's good to go at 11:42 a.m., I call the session back into order. Are there any motions? Seeing none, we'll now move to debate on an item concerning modernizing American infrastructure. At this time, are there any authors? Seeing none, any sponsors? Senator Khan, you have it unopposed.
Thank the chair. As always, any indication of when my judges are ready would be great. Growing up, my grandparents told me ridiculous stories about their elaborate journey to school, how they had to walk marathons, climb through caves, and avoid sinkholes just to evade danger. Quite honestly, if we don't do anything about our current degrading infrastructure, I'll be telling those same stories. Affirm. The problem for the rest of today's round, and the one that my bill attempts to solve, is a large one: revitalizing our infrastructure. Josh Bivens from the Economic Policy Institute explains on July 18th of 2017. Overall spending on infrastructure in the United States has been in long-term decline since 1979, ranging from water pipes to public facilities in our energy grid. That's the exact reason why we see 500,000 children across the country with lead poisoning from corroded pipes, 14,000 deaths every year from poor highway infrastructure. These problems all seem burdensome on their own, but the real problem stems from this very chamber, because Forbes writes on February 17th of 2018, that because states are given the majority of infrastructure funding in the United States, nationwide issues are almost never addressed in the first place, meaning the only ones we have to blame for the quality of our infrastructure is ourselves. When states do have the funds, they don't fix these structural deficiencies. And when we leave these repairs to be dealt with at a local level, the impacts on our nation have been devastating. Bad highway design alone contributes to over 20,000 American fatalities. But don't just take it from the numbers. The fact that Flint, Michigan didn't have clean water for 4 years speaks for itself. An October 2018 report by the National Transportation Research Group furthers that 44% of our roads and highways are in poor condition, costing Americans $200 billion a year in repairs and operating costs. Moreover, an article from the NIH reports that traffic congestion for poor roads increases emissions and worsens global warming by contributing to 33% of all carbon dioxide emissions. It's time for a change because our negligence has led to Americans costing their lives on the ground. Now, I don't think today's debate will be about whether or not we need to improve infrastructure, but today's debate is going to be about the efficacy of my solution. So let me outline exactly why my bill is the perfect solution. Section 1 of my legislation enacts comprehensive infrastructure reform in many areas to address every single crack in our existing infrastructure. Section 1 has repairs on public utilities and infrastructure, ensuring that all Americans have access to safe, reliable, and efficient transportation networks. But infrastructure in the modern age also has a more broad definition. It also means improvising on the protection of electric utility grids and providing aviation technology. And this can be done through public-private partnerships at will to maximize efficiency. Section 3 puts multiple executive departments in charge of the oversight of this project, all of which this Senate has direct oversight over, as well as an annual grant so we can continue to fund this legislation as time goes on. And luckily, the Economic Policy Institute says that infrastructure pays for itself because each $100 billion in infrastructure spending would increase job growth by 1 million full-time jobs and increase private sector output by 20%, meaning today's solution is sustainable. Far too long, we've let our roads and our highways fall at the expense of our people.
Thank you, Senator. Speech time, 3 minutes and 8 seconds. For 2 minutes of direct questioning, questioners please rise. We'll begin with Senator Brombot.
Senator, you put $2 trillion up to the discretion of all the departments listed in Section 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
Aren't those departments changing every year with new presidencies and new cabinets?
I mean, sure, every 4 years, but that doesn't really, make a difference. So where are you going with that?
How do we know what projects are going to be prioritized based on what's politically okay for?
I don't think that's unique to infrastructure, right? Whenever a new administration comes in, that could happen with any single policy plan. Like plans change.
Senator Biram.
Where the $2 trillion is going?
Senator Biram.
Hi, Senator. So how are we funding today's legislation?
We're funding it essentially through a gas tax and through adding to the federal deficit. So on that gas tax, I actually want to acknowledge that that's a bipartisan session. I originally in today's debate wanted to advocate for another infrastructure plan, and that didn't have the gas tax, but I realized this Congress is partisan, so I needed to make a bipartisan session for that.
Isn't this Congress already in line to debate a very similar infrastructure bill next week sent by President?
Right, President Biden's, yes, but that one adds to the federal deficit. Again, this one needs to be more bipartisan so we can actually pass it.
Thank you, Senator Dilip Kumar.
So gas tax, want it or not, it's a part of this legislation. Doesn't it harm low-income Americans when you're
I would agree it does, and I would amend it to not have that and I can co-sponsor legislation with you if you want to do that, but we need to ensure that it passes if that happens.
Sure, then how do we pay for this legislation?
Okay, I would just add to the federal deficit because $2 trillion, and as I said, it pays for itself in the Economic Policy Institute card, isn't that much over a long period of time.
Thank you, Senator Lytle.
Absolutely. So Senator Khan, specifically when we're looking at the concept of infrastructure, is that a partisan or bipartisan issue?
The concept of infrastructure is pretty bipartisan. I had said in my speech that I don't think anyone.
Right. So the current Biden proposal, how much money does that provide to literal physical infrastructure?
That's $2 trillion.
The Biden program to literal physical infrastructure, roughly $600 billion, right? So that's much less than this program. So wouldn't it be more beneficial for the state of infrastructure to pass this program today?
Sure, and that's why I'm saying that over time, this has $2 trillion and this has annual grants.
Thank you,
but we have $2 trillion.
Senator Khan, thank you. That was a speech in affirmation. All negative speakers, please rise. Between Senators Biram and Taiwan, that's going to go to Senator Taiwan.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the PO in the chamber, and again, of course, the judges, that's Senator Tailon, Taillon, speaking for the second time today, for the first time on this piece of legislation. So judges, let me find you. I'll just give you a minute to get ready. Let me know if you need more time. I'll begin in a moment. Okay. Thomas Jefferson once said, "Do not bite at the bait of pleasure until you know there is no hook beneath it." Senators, you would usually not find me opposed to a piece of legislation seeking to invest in this nation's infrastructure. Not only is it a job creator and economy booster, but our infrastructure has long been neglected. And as Japan, Germany, and other countries around the world modernize and innovate, America is falling behind. So, Senators, when I first began to read this piece of legislation, I remember vaguely nodding in agreement. In other words, Senators, I bit the hook. This bill is not only frustratingly ignorant of the current state of politics regarding infrastructure, but falls back on a harmful funding mechanism at one of the worst conceivable times. Senators, for these reasons, negate. So, senators, my first issue with today's legislation requires context. As previous senators have mentioned in questioning, right now negotiations are coming to a close between members of this Senate and the Biden administration on something that may sound familiar, a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. In other words, interpret this bill as an alternative to the Biden administration deal. As CNBC puts it in March of this year, quote, if signed into law, the Biden proposal would rank as one of the largest efforts ever to curb the greenhouse gas emissions and advance the president's commitment to put the country on a path to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. That's right. While no Green New Deal, Biden's plan is an infrastructure bill that focuses its funding on an investment on sustainable and green infrastructure, renewable energy, and electronic transportation technology. On the flip side, this legislation does not mention renewables, sustainability, or green tech even once. And that's important considering that according to the World Bank in April of 2018, 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from infrastructure construction and operations such as power plants, buildings, and transport. Senators understand the current negotiations are about potentially lowering the $2 trillion price tag. Make no mistake, passing this $2 trillion deal is not in addition to Biden's plan. An AF vote here is a neg vote on the Biden plan. But second, another major problem that I have with this bill is the gas tax. Let's do some math. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the average gas price in the U.S. right now is about $2.15. Meanwhile, statistics from earlier this year show that 90% of Americans on average spend $3,000 a year on gas. Using these numbers, you can estimate conservatively that with a 10-cent gas tax increase under this bill, Americans who rely upon cars would see an average increase in cost of about $300 a year. This may not seem like much, but look at who it hurts the most. According to a 2018 report from the Federal Reserve, nearly 40% of Americans would be unable to pay an emergency $400 expense without going into debt. That was 2018. We are now just exiting a global pandemic, seeing record levels of unemployment and balancing on the edge of an imminent housing and eviction crisis. So for wealthier Americans, this would have little effect. But this global pandemic is the worst possible time to test the financial breaking point of working class Americans. Senators, the fact of the matter is that this bill is strategically placed to derail a far better proposal and utilizes policies that disproportionately impact the poorest Americans at the least convenient time I can imagine. Do not bite the hook, senators. Vote in the negation, and let's get back to actually getting things done. Thank you.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 8 seconds. Board line for 2 minutes of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Nuttall.
Okay, in your first point, you faulted this piece of legislation for not doing enough to fight climate change, and in your second point, you faulted this piece of legislation for having a measure that fights climate change. Which one is it?
Oh, absolutely. Gas tax does not actually curb the effects of climate change. As I mentioned in my speech, it
but they reduce emissions, don't they?
No, actually, because this has been proven many times. Oil and gas is an inelastic good, meaning that Americans don't decide whether to buy it based on the price, such as blueberries. They buy it based on whether or not they need it. And Americans right now need it, especially essential workers who still have to go to in-person. That's what we're hurting.
In regards to a gas tax, the demographic you're most concerned about is low-income Americans, right?
Sure.
And who operates the majority of infrastructure jobs that would come out of this bill?
Lower income Americans.
So if they're benefiting and being marginally harmed, isn't this bill good?
Okay, but the benefit of increased jobs still comes with the Biden proposal. The only difference is that we are not hurting them through the gas tax, and we are investing in green infrastructure. I think that's a benefit.
Speculative politics when we're debating this now. We are the Senate.
We're debating this now as an alternative to the other plan. That's something I explained in my speech. It's one or the other.
Senator Mittermeier.
Following off of that last line of questioning, let's even forget jobs for a second. What group does a lack of good infrastructure most directly harm?
That's still going to mostly harm low-income Americans.
Okay, so if we're helping them by providing them the infrastructure they need, that harms them, and providing them with jobs, isn't that a win-win?
Okay, but again, as I just said this in the last questioning period, both plans invest in infrastructure. The only difference is that this one includes a gas tax that harms Americans, and it doesn't invest in the very important issue of climate change, right?
We need to pass something now. We don't know that bill is going to pass. We're the Senate. We decide now.
Thank you.
Hey, Senator, quick question. Does driving on bad infrastructure cost Americans money?
Absolutely.
Yeah, how much does it cost the average motorist?
I don't have this exact statistic.
Annually, $599. So doesn't that outweigh your statistic of how much this legislation costs?
No, because again, my advocacy is that we should be supporting a different infrastructure bill. I've said this multiple times.
Sure, but your whole point was that this would cost people additional money per year. Doesn't this statistic outweigh your own?
Only if there's no alternative to
Question
Will
time.
it give these people additional money?
Thank you, Senator Zhang. Question time's elapsed. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Once again, any and all speakers in the affirmation. Between Senators Barrett and Nuttall. That's going to go to Senator Nuttall.
I thank the chair. And yeah, just a thumbs up whenever you guys are ready. Perfect. In that case, I will begin. A car accident shouldn't be a life sentence for families who suffer. And thanks to this legislation, a hole in our road will no longer leave a hole in your wallet. Let's patch up any holes that exist in our infrastructure and affirm, firstly, because we boost private productivity, and secondly, we save American lives. But firstly, we boost private productivity. Now, Senator Khan, you spent much of your speech talking about funding shortfalls for infrastructure and how those need to be addressed. And Senator Brombat, in questioning, you said that it was puzzling that we give so much authority to so many different government agencies over this funding. I would like to clear up that misconception right now, Senator Brombat, because this legislation specifically dictates that there will be a priority for investment. When we have sections A, B, C, D, and so on under section 2, that means that there is a priority for which things we invest in, with public-private partnerships at the top and all other infrastructure needs at the bottom. But now, Senator Khan, you talked about the benefits of jobs from this piece of legislation, but I'd like to expand upon this and specifically talk about our benefits to GDP growth. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in March of 2019, recent research has found that infrastructure investments generally result in a more productive economy and typically a means of higher wages and better quality of life, which most typically help those in low-income sectors, which is contrary to what Senator Tayan has just told you, and that estimates have found that in the depths of the Great Recession, a $1 infrastructure investment resulted in a $1.50 output in GDP growth. It doesn't matter whether this money is saved if a boat arrives 2 hours earlier, or if a donut truck doesn't drive off a bridge and spill all of those donuts so they can't deliver and earn as much money as they could to help the economy. Let's increase productivity across the board and the wages of Americans as a whole. Now, Senator Khan, you've also talked about deaths in your speech, but rather than say rehash, you've talked so much about the deaths resulting from bad infrastructure. But I'd like to strike a different tone here, because I'd like to specifically clash with Senator Tayan's point that the gas tax does not reduce carbon emissions, and in fact, it only serves to hurt low-income Americans. Because while Senator Tayan values money, I, as a senator, value lives. This is because the National Bureau of Economic Research finds that estimates imply that a 10-cent increase in the gas tax would reduce US carbon emissions from the transportation sector by about 1.5%. But why is this important? A study from the University of Minnesota in July of 2020 found that air pollution from sources in the United States kills 100,000 Americans every year. Pass this piece of legislation so that less Americans have to sit at the bedside of their loved ones to say goodbye for the last time, so that less have to walk out to darker skies, knowing not when they end. Holes in the road can become holes in our wallet, and holes in lives can become holes in our heart. Let's end both and affirm.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 15 seconds. For a 1 minute direct question period, questioners rise. Senator Taiwan.
I thank the chair. Senator, I realize that I did just spend 4 minutes talking about this, but don't we actually get all the benefits you talk about, jobs, GDP, investments for private businesses through the Biden plan? But we also, you're championing climate change. We also focus on an issue that deserves our focus, which is climate change.
Exactly, yes, but that's why I champion the gas tax specifically, which is a measure that you railed against.
Okay, so you think passing a gas tax, which would lower some emissions but mostly hurt Americans, is better than the Biden plan, which would specifically invest in technology to lower emissions on the large scale?
Okay, I take issue with your...
Senator Khan.
Hi, Senator. Why are nationwide infrastructure plans better than state infrastructure plans?
Nationwide infrastructure plans are better because, as you outlined in your speech, with statewide infrastructure plans, states often receive the funds but they don't do anything with it, but we create a more centralized structure under the federal
so
government.
Specifically with green policy, don't some states then use their discretion like to not go on those green policies? So don't we need green policy objectives in this legislation?
I would say that green policy objectives are important, and I would champion that kind of thing, but we already have that to a certain extent with the gas tax.
Thank you, Senator. That was a speech in the affirmation. All negative speakers, please rise. Senator Dilip Kumar, you have it unopposed.
Hi, everybody. That's Senator Dilip Kumar speaking for the second time this session. Once again, I'll wait about 5 seconds. If you're not ready, please do let me know. Everybody good? Perfect. So far in this debate, you've heard the affirmation give point after point about the crumbling state of American infrastructure. But in trying to fix the potholes on our streets, don't ignore the holes in today's legislation. Fail this bill because it increases gentrification by attracting high-income households. Senator Nuttall, even when economic output is increased when you pass this bill, high-income Americans are going to use that as a reason to move to these areas with newly built infrastructure. In fact, look to a joint report by Yale and Brown University in November 2014. One of the largest domestic pull factors for wealthy Americans in the past decade has revolved around economic potential fueled by infrastructure investment. That's the exact problem with this bill. When high-income Americans move to low-income areas, they increase gentrification dramatically. And Senator Nuttall, guess what increased infrastructure developments in previously low-income areas means? More particulate pollution in these neighborhoods as a result of that construction, worsening the health of low-income Americans. In fact, it's empirically proven. Senator Khan, the evidence I'm about to give you is not just from a localized area. It's from rural, suburban, and urban areas. The Center for Regional Policy at Northeastern University found in a report over 42 areas that received increased public transport and other infrastructure funding. They found that 74% of households saw unprecedented increases in their rent, driving many low-income families out of those areas altogether. Senator Nuttall, the economic output you talk about will just go to the high-income Americans that are left in the area, not the low-income Americans that truly need it in the first place. So why is gentrification the most important impact in this round? First, it cripples the public transit system, along with the rest of the affirmative advocacy. The CRP at Northeastern University furthers that as a result of this gentrification, in 71% of neighborhoods, ownership of a vehicle actually increased. That's because high-income Americans aren't going to use public transportation and instead opt for their own vehicles. Seeing better roads on the roads, they're going to use their cars. But even if you don't buy that, at the affirmation's highest ground, wealthy Americans are the ones using the infrastructure we build, not low-income Americans who are going to be driven out of these areas with new infrastructure development. But second, gentrification leaves low-income Americans completely homeless. Look to a meta-analysis by Harvard University in 2015. Areas with high rates of gentrification see far higher homelessness rates and larger racial and income inequalities. Senator Nuttall, for Americans struggling to make ends meet, a 1.5% increase in GDP matters far less than the fact that they don't have a place to live anymore. The holes in today's bills are just too large to be patched up. Don't pass policy that's more broken than our infrastructure.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes and 5 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Nuttall.
How is gentrification a more pertinent impact than lives?
I would argue that when people are kicked out onto the street as a result of homelessness, that costs lives as well.
Okay, can you quantify that? Because I've quantified the lives from carbon emissions.
Okay, I don't have a source directly on me, but it's an empirical fact that when people are homeless, they don't have access to healthcare and they don't have access to running water and food. That's inherently dangerous.
Okay, but even then, we have social programs for the homeless, but once you're dead, right?
We can't use social programs to just kick every low-income American out of their home. That's inherently unethical.
Low-income Americans are usually the ones working construction and transportation jobs, right?
To some extent, sure.
And we fund construction and transportation, right?
To some extent, sure. Oh, construction and sure.
What's wrong with both landlords and low-income Americans making more money?
Okay, low-income Americans making more money is completely outweighed by the fact that their rent increases dramatically, right? The increase in their income isn't proportional to the increase in their living expenses.
How? Then landlords just make no money.
No, landlords increase their rents. They tax low-income Americans.
Question time has elapsed. That was a speech in negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Between Senators Barrett and Medigovic, Senator Medigovic does have it.
Thank you. That's Senator Medigovic speaking for the second time in the session. Any chance anyone's not ready? Cool. I'll get started then. For a country whose success was paved by the backbreaking work of our most dedicated Americans, it feels like we don't give a whole lot back. Because as diligent and focused as you may be, the same world Americans built is literally crumbling around them. Ultimately, it's because this bill rebuilds what's falling apart that I'm so proud to pass. First, I want to address the question of how consumers will be affected. Senator Dilip Kumar in Talon frames an increased gas tax as bad for low-income Americans, but I'd call for us to consider the climate a bit more. The price of climate change for the poor easily outweighs whatever a gas tax or gentrification could possibly do. Let me be the first senator to challenge the assumption that a gas tax is categorically bad. In fact, the Korean Journal of Internal Medicine in 2009 says that a 2% increase in gas prices would save the planet 88,000 tons of emissions, which would save us $160 billion a year in fewer health expenditures for mainly poor individuals most vulnerable to climate change by 2040. At the negation's highest ground, their best excuse to avoid poverty now is literally to accept it later in spades. Secondarily, I'm going to make the case that uniquely lower income Americans prosper the most from the growth of construction and transit when we develop infrastructure, much more than they could ever be harmed. Currently, transportation jobs are struggling. There's a lot of occupations depending on good infrastructure and development, and the biggest of that being trucking. According to the Congressional Budget Office in 2012, though, poor roads have single-handedly caused an extra $14,000 in repairs to trucks per truck, making the industry hard to grow as our infrastructure declines. However, investing in infrastructure helps these critical industries. The problem is that in a world that's becoming increasingly dominated by complex jobs as simple ones are phased out, trucking remains one of the most popular and important occupations for that reason. In fact, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2013 reports that half of all transportation and trucking jobs can be filled by someone with less than a college diploma. Investing in our road infrastructure and restarting transportation sector growth makes sure millions of Americans who don't necessarily have the finances or time to go to college have a level of economic security when basic jobs like these are on the rise. Put this together, and you'll understand that basic jobs that are related to infrastructure are the lifeline of low-income America. For middle and lower America, basic jobs are everything, with specific emphasis on those related to transit. In fact, the University of California in 2015 studied how updated transportation infrastructure, as opposed to dilapidated roads and bridges that we have now, can save the average low-income family $10,000, and we're 22% of low-income jobs. Every negation impact about protecting the poor easily flips to the affirmation, and everyone else collapses in questioning. 50-hour work weeks are struggles the hardest working families around this country are glad to accept, if it's the difference between support and ruin. Though not everyone is fortunate enough to do it as a doctor, lawyer, or politician, it's our responsibility to realize their dream for every walk of life. Thank you.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 11 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Dilip Kumar.
So a yes or no question, do trucking companies employ truck drivers?
Yes.
Right. So if their employees, aren't the trucks owned by the trucking companies, and any harms therefore felt by the companies, not the actual employees themselves?
Correct, but that also hinders scaling quite a bit, meaning people can't get trucking jobs if the companies aren't profitable.
How often have companies actually passed on profits to employees in the long term?
That's not what I'm arguing. I'm saying the sector can't grow if trucking companies aren't profitable.
Thank you. Senator Talon.
Thank you, Senator. I feel like a broken record here, but why is raising taxes on the people who drive the most, which is working class Americans, better for the climate and for climate activism than literally investing this infrastructure money into sustainable infrastructure while still getting the jobs benefits and the other benefits and the GDP and everything you talk about?
Let me make the clarification right now. A gas tax is good because it decreases climate change. Climate change is most felt by low-income Americans.
Okay, but when you have proven harms on poor Americans, is that our best option? We have other options available. We have very good options.
Thank you, senators. Question time has elapsed. That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Senator Brombot, you have it unopposed.
I thank the chair. Again, that's Senator Brombot, spelled Brahmbatt. I'm just going to pin my PO, so if you can let me know when my judges are ready. We all good? So LEGO recently announced a $1 billion initiative to move to sustainable blocks by 2030 as part of a plan to reduce their carbon footprint. It's when LEGO puts more effort into saving our sick planet than the entire federal government that we realize this Congress needs to be serious about sustainable and even ethical policy. Contrary to what the affirmation will have you believe, this legislation is not the first building block. First, let's settle one of the largest points of contention in today's debate, the environment, primarily brought up by Senator Talon and primarily challenged by Senator Medigovic in the speech before me. According to American Progress, they find in April of 2018 that the National Environmental Policy Act that we passed was enacted to ensure that environmental considerations were taken into account when building infrastructure. However, less than 1% of projects require a full environmental impact statement. We need to address that issue first. Less than 1% of infrastructure projects leads me to come to the logical conclusion that in order to maximize the $2 trillion allocated under this bill, to Senator Nuttall, the departments in this bill will try to maximize their impact by getting the most initiatives out of the way in the cheapest way possible, which oftentimes means that we don't use sustainable means when building infrastructure. Now, how do I know that $2 trillion is not enough? Well, let me quantify Senator Lytle's questioning block with Senator Khan. The conversation in March 16th of 2017, they said that remodeling our power infrastructure could take anywhere from $500 billion to $5 trillion, depending on the mechanism we use to construct it. And that's only one part of the bill. We barely accomplish anything, and we accomplish it in an unsustainable way and implement a harmful gas tax. The negation weighs out. Next, Senator Khan gives us several statistics about why we need to improve our energy infrastructure and champions bipartisanship, but his mechanism leaves everything up to the discretion of the departments listed in Section 3. This legislation is so vague that $2 trillion could be used to favor any public-private partnership on whichever states the current administration would deem fit. We politicize these funds when we could really have bipartisan legislation that targets specific sectors with more specific regulations that are not entirely up to the bureaucracy. Now, the next point of contention is about the issue of displacement and low-income Americans. No one in today's debate has addressed the fact that one needs land in order to build infrastructure. Eminent domain is when the government takes property in order to make public infrastructure, which is the primary mechanism we're going to be using under this bill. However, we see eminent domain the most prevalent in low-income and rural communities. Moreover, the just compensation that they receive for eminent domain is not just. To Senator Medigovic and Nuttall, you literally displace thousands of Americans in order to make this infrastructure because we don't have any regulation against it in this bill. Our childhood pastime is passing the benchmark for sustainability. So the question becomes, why aren't we?
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 7 seconds. For 1 minute of direct questioning, questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Khan.
Hi, Senator. So were you saying eminent domain just targets low-income households?
No, I'm saying that you need land to build it, and
Right.
most of the time the land happens to be on low-income land in rural communities.
Why does it happen to be on low-income land in rural communities? Why is it not
Your
proportionate?
land is. And it's honestly just easier to get that land because the government also has to pay less compensation to those people.
Okay, what about the fact that most of it goes into revitalizing existing infrastructure? So like if a road or a highway is dilapidated, you would
So public-private partnership projects, you did not define that. That's what you just said.
All right, so just bouncing off of that previous line of questioning, what part of this legislation says we're building new infrastructure instead of just going back to repair that one that we have?
Well, what part of this legislation says that we're just repairing it?
Well, why does it make sense to build new infrastructure when we already have infrastructure?
Go your highest ground and say that we're repairing infrastructure. Repairing still means making more efficient, which oftentimes means expanding. But roads.
Why? Why can't we just repair it to make it more efficient? Why do we have to expand it?
To assume that our current infrastructure in the land that it's at is going
But the problem is potholes, not that there aren't enough roads, right?
Question time has elapsed. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Between Senators Lytle, Barrett, and Minnemeyer. That's going to go to Senator Lytle.
Thank you for recognizing me. This is Senator Lytle, spelled Lytle, representing the Yellow Rose District of Texas, speaking for the second time this legislative session. And knowing that the President of the Senate is always ready when any of my judges are ready, I would appreciate any indication, and I'll begin. Excellent, excellent, and excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, about 10 years ago, well, much longer than that if we consider the fact that I'm a senator, my father was driving down I-35 with me in the car. We were in, well, driving is a bit of an understatement, considering that we were in roughly standstill traffic for approximately 30 minutes, to which I turned to my father and asked, "Dad, when is this highway ever going to be done?" And his response was, "Probably never." And that's because of the incredibly terrible state of United States infrastructure, which is exactly why you're going to affirm today. As we can note from the American Society of Civil Engineers on June 9th of 2021, note that that is just 1 week ago, the United States ranks approximately a D- in transit with regards to their grading system. A D- in transit, that's worse than most developing nations. 1/5 of our entire infrastructure is considered poor and dilapidated. But I'd like to address one of Senator Brombot's points that she mentioned in her past speech, which is that eminent domain is going to be a significant issue. But let's notice that this bill is directly focused on targeting current existing infrastructure. That's what the word modernize means. But let's also address the point brought up previously by Senator Dilip Kumar on the point of gentrification and why gentrification won't be seen within this piece of legislation specifically, because gentrification exists in either world. Infrastructure has to happen. But let's notice one of the main benefits of this piece of legislation comes particularly with regards to, with Section 2 at the very bottom, where they provide grants and loans for municipal infrastructure projects. That includes affordable housing and includes housing that provides for many of those lower income individuals. Gentrification is a wash of a point. But in addition to this, the Rand Corporation states on June 8th of 2021, one Representative Senator Talon, that Biden's infrastructure plan is incredibly unlikely to pass and only promotes 1/4 of all spending needed for infrastructure, considering that the only physical infrastructure spending is roughly $600 billion. That $2 trillion largely goes to social infrastructure as well. Your point is a wash, considering that this piece of legislation actually provides funds for real physical infrastructure. Now, my job as a United States Senator is not just to point out what would be most beneficial for the United States of America. First and foremost, I represent the state of Texas, and I have to point out the very issue that this bill addresses as well, which is energy infrastructure, as ABC News states on February 21st of 2021, substantiating this point. But I, as a senator for the state of Texas, stand for the 69 individuals who died in the first week of our freeze just earlier this year, which was a massive failure of United States energy infrastructure and energy protection. That is solved under this piece of legislation. That, while the other senator from my state was on vacation in Cancun, he should have been doing this, passing this piece of legislation, solving our infrastructure issues that will not harm lower income individuals, but in fact will save the lives of real American citizens. Affirm.
Thank you. Speech time, 3 minutes, 15 seconds. For 1 minute of direct questioning, questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Brombot.
Senator, I applaud your advocacy for your state, but how do you know that the $2 trillion under this bill is going to go to you and your state specifically?
Absolutely. So let's consider that part of that very funding is dedicated strictly to energy infrastructure developed among the several states. Pardon me. Well, let me finish very quickly. One of the main areas of energy infrastructure looked at right now is the Texas grid specifically. The other grids are fine.
How much does it take to model energy infrastructure as a total?
The estimation is just several hundred billion right now.
So I told you in my speech.
Thank you. Senator Beeman.
Right, the Texas grid needs little to be secured.
Hi, Senator. Why is this bill the only possible bill that can uniquely solve for climate change?
It's probably not, but the fundamental reality is that this is the one we have on the table right now, and the one that is actually succeeding in the fact that it will provide real money for real infrastructure.
Why are your impacts unique? If we can simply pass a legislation that does the exact same thing without.
Or you could pass this one that passes this very issue. Biden's plan provides not nearly enough money for any regards. That's why Senator Talon's point falls. But this is a piece of legislation that will solve the problem. You haven't found that in any negation speech.
Question time has elapsed. That was a speech in affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Senator Beeram, you have it unopposed.
Hi everyone, that's Senator Beeram, spelled B-E-E-R-A-M, speaking for the second time in today's legislative session. I'm at the leisure of all, so just any verbal indication if any of my judges are not ready. Awesome, I'll get started. There is no country like America. We don't derive our strength from arms or our power from wealth. The power behind our country is the ideals of democracy, liberty, and unyielding hope. With such a unique standing and such a unique burden, it is your profound obligation to fight tooth and nail for these values. I actually agree with speakers like Senator Khan and Nuttall. We need to fund infrastructure. But first, I want to finally prove why the gas tax is the ultimate harm of the negation. Let's expand on everything Senator Talon told us. The Motley Fool found in January of 2017 that because low-income Americans have a higher need to drive, just like Senator Dilip Kumar told you, they on average use 1,000 gallons more of gasoline per year. With the gas tax, they would be in hundreds of dollars of debt. Now, what is $100 in this round? CNBC found in December of last year that 25% of them have no extra money after paying for necessities. For the rest of this debate, when you think about $100, don't think about it as $100. Think about it as a rent check. Think about it as food on the table and clothes for the winter. If we allow this bill to pass, many Americans won't be able to pay for these necessities. Senator Medigovic and Little, you say that fewer Americans will use gas. Here's the issue. Illinois Business Law Journal found that low-income Americans are so dependent on it that they cannot stop using it because there are no other alternatives. If we pass this legislation, we are taxing a necessities they need to survive. Let's compare these impacts. This goes way beyond finances. In April of 2015, the Urban Institute published a report where they stated that families in debt have a life expectancy shorter by over 6 years compared to any other American citizen. The infrastructure made with today's legislation will be tainted by the lives of thousands of low-income Americans. Senator Nuttall and Lytle, we can find other ways to find infrastructure that don't target low-income Americans. There is no need to sacrifice our values and constituents for roads and highways. Senator Medigovic, let's compare our two impacts. At your highest ground, you state that we can save Americans $1,400 one time. I am telling you that we continually charge them hundreds of dollars for their entire life. If we buy everything you tell us, we still win this debate. And this impact, paired with gentrification, is more important than anything you tell us. Senator Medigovic and Lytle, you claim that the gas tax solves for climate change, but not a single speaker has proved to me why it's the only unique mechanism to do that. I'd contend if other bills can do that as well, and we have these harms, that's a reason to fail. Look past the surface. The fundamental meaning of being American is not our wealth, and it's not our military. It's the hope that lives in all of us for a better America. Don't let that hope die. Fail this legislation.
Thank you. Speech time, 2 minutes, 58 seconds. For 1 minute of direct questioning, questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Medigovic.
A gas tax costs low-income families $100 a year, right?
Sure.
So I actually quantified the amount saved by this bill at $10,000 a year. What's $9,000 and $900?
First, there's no guarantee that these jobs go to low-income Americans because at the end of the day, one, we don't know if they're building new ones or repairing them. The extent of that is completely unknown.
Can you answer my question real quick? Who operates trucking jobs?
I mean, arguably the people like low-income Americans, but like that does not outweigh the impact of
the last thing you just said.
Yeah, because it's $100 per mile per year. That compounds itself.
Senator Biram, I pointed out in my speech that this bill addresses affordable housing. Doesn't that reduce costs for lower income individuals more than $100 a year?
No, because we've already proven to you that because of gentrification, prices increase because like rich.
Right, but more affordable housing is available through municipal projects. So doesn't that reduce overall costs?
No, because municipal housing isn't going to exist all across America.
So even though municipal housing is specifically funded in this bill, it's not going to work?
Municipal housing is also affected by gentrification. Like those two are non-unique.
Okay, so government-owned municipal housing isn't going to help.
Question time has elapsed. That was a speech in the negation. Affirmation speakers, please rise. Between Senators Barrett, Bittemeyer, Zhang, and Ledoux. Senator Zhang does have it.
I thank the chair. Hey everybody, this is Senator Zhang speaking for the second time today. I'm at the leisure of all. Just a nod, smile, any signal when ready. Are all my judges ready? All right, then I'll begin. It is often said that a trip is not necessarily about the destination, and that the journey can be just as important. For far too long, our incompetence and complacency have allowed us to perpetuate a cycle of broken infrastructure and broken dreams. It is because safeguarding the journeys that our Americans make has been constantly neglected by this nation that I'm standing here today to pass. Pass because first, today's policy increases economic investment because it improves investment in failing public infrastructure. Let's look at one of the main questions in today's debate. Does this policy help or hurt low-income Americans? Senator Dilip Kumar says no because of gentrification. But what he fails to establish is whether or not investment in infrastructure leads to the displacement that he talks about. Look to past precedent to see where his point falls. Look to Xiadi Li, a researcher on urban economics and real estate, where he tells you in his 2019 paper that for every 10% increase in housing value within a 500-foot radius, residential rents actually decrease by 1%. This rent reduction is caused by the completion of new amenities within the community. Senator Bromba, you actually worry in your point about the allocation of money under this policy. Let me address that concern. Section 1 of this legislation specifically says that the funding in this bill will go towards addressing shortfalls in infrastructure spending, which ensures that the most needy people in our nation will be receiving the funding that they critically need. And that is important to understand because look to the U.S. Energy and Information Administration, which tells you on September 19th of 2018 that 1 in 5 households have reported reducing or entirely forgoing necessities such as food or medicine to pay for rent or other bills. Let's make one thing clear here. Simply looking for an alternative piece of policy that does the same thing is not an excuse to fail. For every second that we delay passing this piece of legislation, countless of our most vulnerable constituents are sucked into an endless abyss of desperation and death. Stand with me and pass. But you're also passing today because second, today's policy revitalizes American infrastructure because increasing the gas tax bolsters revenue for repairs. Look to the Congressional Budget Office, which tells you on December 8th of 2016 that the option to increase federal excise taxes for gasoline and diesel fuel by 35 cents per gallon would increase federal revenues by $474 billion. Now, Senators Talian and Biram both talk about how an increase in gas tax would cost Americans money, but they both fail to articulate the entire point of this legislation, which is investing in infrastructure. Let's look to the TRIP, which tells you on October of 2018 that the average motorist in the U.S. is using $599 annually, a total of $130 billion total in additional vehicle operating costs as a result of driving on roads in need of repair. Now, Senator Biram in questioning conceded that the average American loses $100 because of this gasoline tax. Now, this statistic clearly outweighs by hundreds of dollars, saving our constituents crucial amounts of money. Forking out hundreds of dollars on extra gas is absolutely unacceptable. But these Americans are what need our help right now. Stand with me. Pass.
Thank you, Senator. Speech time, 3 minutes, 15 seconds. For 1 minute of direct questioning, questioners please rise. Between those standing, we'll begin with Senator Talon.
Okay, Senator, you mentioned that the gas tax and raising funds from the gas tax is specifically to fund infrastructure, but is taxing the poorest Americans, the people who we've proven, the people who drive the most are the poorest Americans, is taxing them really the best source of funding for infrastructure?
So here's the thing, right? So your statistic was around $300 in extra expenses. As I've shown you, the amount that they save on average is going to be higher than the cost.
Okay, no, you talk about motorists. You're specifically talking about motorists. So
Motorists
maybe
are people
motorists
who
benefit
drive,
from this,
right?
but poor Americans in
Well,
general, are
motorist
they
is
really
someone
the
who
best
drives
source
a
of
car,
funding?
which is also someone who would be affected by a gas tax.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Nuttall.
Does this piece of legislation go into effect immediately upon passage?
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
Right, it takes 6 months. So when you said that 1 week delayed is bad enough, how do any of those impacts stand?
Well, I'm just saying that every second we delay, like, there's no point in adding extra delay. That's my point.
What would be wrong with passing the Biden plan then if we could get that through immediately?
Again, like I said before, finding an alternative piece of policy is not an excuse to fail the bill we have before us.
Okay, but still, if this piece of legislation will take longer to pass through.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. That was a speech in the affirmation. Negative speakers, please rise. Any and all speakers in the negation. Seeing none, the chair frowns upon a one-sided debate, but will move to break the cycle. Are there any speeches in the affirmation? Between Senators Minnemeyer, Ledoux, and Barrett. That's going to go to Senator Minnemeyer.
I thank the chair. That is Senator Minnemeyer speaking for my second time in this legislative session. Judges, you guys know the spiel. Just give me some indication if you're not ready. Okay. Looks good. The 1800s are known for many things. Plumbing is not one of them. And yet the city of Philadelphia, I promise I didn't make this up, still relies on pipes installed before the Civil War to make sure that its 1.5 million citizens have water to drink. If nothing else convinces you to pass this bill, just remember that Philadelphia is using pipes from an era when people thought bathing was bad for you, didn't use toothpaste, and didn't even know what a germ was. Please affirm today's legislation. But first, let's put this gas tax debate to rest once and for all. Senator Tallien and Biram have explained to you why the gas tax included in this bill will harm low-income communities. And I'll admit, that's not necessarily a bad argument. But the problems low-income communities face cannot wait for a perfect bill to come around and far outweigh the weight of a gas tax. So let's examine these problems for real. Let's talk some more about pipes, because it's not just Philadelphia that needs an upgrade. Clean Water for America finds in their most recent report that more than 27 million Americans are served by water systems violating health-based standards established in the Safe Drinking Water Act. Let's also look at its disproportionate effect on minorities. As according to Metropolitan Planning Council in 2020, 65% of the Black and Latinx population of Illinois lives in communities that have 95% of all the lead pipes in the state. Senators, let's not forget what happened in Flint, what happened in Love Canal, what happened in Hinckley. All across this country, our systems have failed, and our minority and low-income constituents are waking up to severe health problems and mountains of medical bills. That outweighs a gas tax. But second, healthcare. This is because better public transit gives low-income communities the ability to go to the hospital when they are sick. According to a study by Carrie Smith of the University of Minnesota in November of 2017, transportation infrastructure impacts the usage of healthcare services, as individuals without reliable transportation are more likely to delay and forego necessary appointments, preventative care, and health maintenance activities. So forget jobs. This is why surface transportation infrastructure is so important once again for our lower income constituents. Because senators, the last thing on a single mother's mind when her son has cancer should be how she is going to get him to the doctor's office. The fact that she has to even think about that under the American flag means we aren't thinking about it enough in this chamber. Senators, banking on another piece of legislation to pass through this partisan Congress is not an option. We need to take action right now. After all, when water pipes burst, people's homes flood. When drinking water contains lead, people's children get sick. And when people can't make it to the hospital in time, people die. And finally, let's understand that the gentrification argument championed by Senator Dilip Kumar and backed by Biram on the negation is fundamentally flawed. Because not only do infrastructure investments support our low-income Americans, as I've proven throughout my entire speech, but to echo the concerns of Senator Lytle, gentrification in urban areas is inevitable Improving our infrastructure and helping our low-income constituents is not. Pass.
Thank you, Senator. Speech time, 3 minutes, 11 seconds. For 1 minute of direct questioning, questioners rise. We'll begin with Senator Barrett.
Thank you. So I understand that we increase the amount of jobs for low-income Americans under today's legislation. Do they have jobs in the status quo?
Yeah, so that's not really what my argument was about. A lot of them don't have jobs. Unemployment rate is pretty high for low-income Americans. What I'm saying specifically in my argument is about how infrastructure affects them the most. But yes, jobs would be a benefit that they get from this legislation as well.
Okay, can you quantify how much money they actually like save when we pass today's legislation?
I heard it was $10,000 from another senator from another card.
Okay,
I didn't have that card personally,
like,
but I think the health impacts outweigh any kind of economic
Thank you,
benefit.
Senator Brumbot.
So, Senator, no one disagrees with you that transportation infrastructure is imperative, but why is sustainably building unsustainable infrastructure that we're going to have to revisit anyway in the future better?
So you were all concerned about how infrastructure programs aren't as sustainable right now, and that can happen in some infrastructure programs. We don't have time to wait around and discuss how exactly we're going to do things. We need to start implementing this infrastructure now so that these low-income Americans don't face these problems.
How can we start implementing infrastructure that we're going to have to revisit in the future anyway because of how unsustainable it is?
Thank you, Senator.
It's so bad in the status quo.
Thank you. Senator Light.
Inquiry.
Go ahead.
When was our hard cap?
I was just about to ask the Parley about that. Yeah, so Parley, we did start.
I have the round starting at 8:27, which would put us at a 10:57 stop. Or sorry, I'm on Pacific time.
So
add 2 hours to that. 12:57 hard stop.
All right, cool. That sounds good to me. All right, perfect. So that was a speech in the affirmation. At this time, are there speeches in the negation? Seeing none, any speeches in the affirmation? Senator Ledoux, you have it unopposed.
Thank the chair. I'm Senator Ledoux, and I'll be speaking for the second time today, and I'll take signs as information that all of my judges are. Senators, I've heard dozens of complaints from my neighbors, friends, and constituents about the lack of broadband access in rural Nebraska. They asked me to do something about it. And today, Senators, the time has come for us to finally address the pressing issue of a lack in infrastructure in our country. We finally have the opportunity to pass a bill. I affirm because first, the increased internet access to rural areas, and second, this bill will help our most vulnerable populations. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we need more internet access in our rural areas. Information coming from the Hill in February of this year shows that at least 20 million people in the country, possibly as many as double that number, do not have access to broadband internet. An extension of internet connectivity to rural America would have social and economic effects for vast areas of the country that feel left out and have lost trust in the federal government. This is a problem that can and must be solved, and this can happen through tax incentives for private-public partnerships. The federal government needs to work with the private sector and states to stop fighting turf battles and to get people internet service they need. Many states have their own offices focused on rural broadband, and there was little coordination with the federal agencies tasked with elements of internet connectivity. The administration can include language to ensure better coordination with faster deployment of rural broadband. In short, there is a need for internet access in rural areas all over the country. By passing this bill, we can solve that issue and reach dozens of communities like the ones in my home state of Nebraska, which largely have no broadband access outside of metropolitan areas. I stand with Senator Nuttall in valuing lives over money. Senator Diplokumar tells you that this may cause gentrification, and Senator Brumbot tells you that this will harm our most vulnerable populations. But like Senator Lytle says, this helps our most vulnerable populations in our society by providing affordable housing. Senator Meinemeyer mentioned Flint in his speech, and I'd like to expand on that, and specifically how it would help those in Flint, Michigan, especially the Black residents. According to an AP article from February 2nd of 2017 about the Civil Rights Commission reports issued, the impoverished city with 57% Black population used water from the Flint River for 18 months without treating it for pipe corrosion. As a result, the water caused lead to reach from old pipes into new homes. Elevated levels of lead, a neurotoxin, were detected in children, and 12 people died. That has been linked to improper treated water. Flint's overall lead level no longer exceeds the federal limit, but authorities still require residents to use faucet filters provided by the state. Time and time again, we miss the opportunity to do right to the environmental harms that we have caused on Black and minority communities across the nation. Finally, on the gas tax, Senator Zhang perfectly summarized and proved why the harms by the tax are a myth, but I'd like to add to that because this bill in turn helps our sustainable efforts and low-income Americans who are harmed the most by climate change effects, which I contend is an existential crisis. It has been established in this debate that our most vulnerable residents will benefit by passing today. So pass this piece of legislation and take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Speech time, 2 minutes, 55 seconds. For 1 minute of direct questioning, please rise. We'll begin with Senator Zhang.
Hey, Senator, just a quick question. Does this bill mandate that we increase internet access in rural areas?
It doesn't mandate that
It doesn't, right?
It does say that more money can also go to other infrastructure needs.
Yeah, it can go to other infrastructure needs, but that's the very last priority, right?
Huh?
So this legislation has priority infrastructure needs. Isn't this rural infrastructure that you talk about the very last priority?
Well, I would consider it's not the very last priority because funding would still be going to tax private and public partnerships.
Sure, but this bill doesn't actually mandate that we invest in internet, right? Oh.
Senator Beer, go ahead.
Hi, Senator. So let's talk about costs. How is $100 per year per mile for someone's entire life equate to less money than a monthly wage?
As I said in my speech, I would contend that the threats of climate change are an existential one and ones that need to be prioritized over money. If we want to mitigate the effects of climate change that help our most vulnerable populations in the country.
Why can't we simply invest in more climate change technology? Like, why is it uniquely through this bill?
Because our heavy reliance on fossil fuels is something that needs to be addressed, and I think this bill does it well by adding a gas tax and then by also reducing.
Thank you, Senators. Question time has elapsed. That was a speech in the affirmation. Please tell me there's a negative speech. Seeing none, we'll break the cycle one last time. Any speakers in the affirmation? Senator Barrett, you have it.
Hi, everyone. My name's Senator Barrett. It's spelled B-A-R-R-E-T-T. It's spelled exactly the same as it was the first time. Speaking on the affirmation, I know. If I could just get any indication when my judges and PO are ready. Cool. And then Judge Fairbanks, are you ready? Awesome sauce. Okay. My district has been working on road construction for what feels like a million years. And as a result, I was late to today's session because of traffic in between this session and Starbucks. While my latte probably could have waited till lunchtime, the necessity to pass today's legislation cannot. It's imperative that we slam the brakes on the status quo and put the pedal to the metal when it comes to today's bill. Pass. First, let's settle this big question of eminent domain championed by Senator Brombad. Understand one thing. We don't expand existing infrastructure under today's legislation. We just repair existing infrastructure. Let me explain why. Transportation for America highlights in a 2017 report that because of the flexibility that federal law gives to states, they continue to spend a significant portion of funding to build new roads, citing that between 2009 and 2014, states spent on average the same amount of funds on roadway expansion as on repair. They conclude that this ultimately induces more traffic while simultaneously increasing the cumulative price tag to keep the nation's network of highways in a state of good repair. Senator Brombad, when the federal government has jurisdiction under Section 2B of today's legislation, we do what the states aren't. That's repairing existing infrastructure, not building new infrastructure. And it's this very component that solves the huge problem. As I explained, we reduce the amount of traffic when we pass today's legislation. There are two key impacts that arise from this notion. The first one is on reduced air pollution. A study by Harvard School of Public Health explains in 2011 that air pollution from traffic congestion in 83% of the nation's largest urban areas contribute to more than 2,200 premature deaths annually, costing the health system $18 billion. Senator Brombad, that's the long-term impact, even if building it is unsustainable. But let's clip our seatbelts in and arrive alive. That's also how we save money for these low-income families that everyone on the negation is advocating for. But next, let me clarify exactly what this means for low-income Americans. Senator Talon and Biram, decreasing traffic means less gas is used and less car crashes occur. That's where low-income Americans save far more than $300 per year, which is what you argue the cost will be under today's legislation. The LA Times explains in 2012 that there are an estimated 40,000 road deaths in the US each year, and many studies have found that these are more likely to involve low-income people in low-income areas. That's because infrastructure is at its worst where low-income Americans actually live. Low-income Americans pay less money on car crashes, and as a result, low-income Americans pay less money on car crashes when we pass today's legislation. That's because we improve the infrastructure that they live in. Slam the brakes on harmful policy in the status quo and pass today's legislation to ensure that we protect our low-income Americans.
Thank you. Speech time, 2 minutes, 56 seconds. For 1 minute of direct questioning, questioners please rise. Between those standing, we'll get started with Senator Brumbaugh.
Hi, Senator.
Hi, Senator. So when we repair something or modernize something, right, doesn't that often mean that we have to either expand it or replace it?
Absolutely not. Filling in a pothole doesn't mean we have to build like a whole new road. It just means we have to put cement in something that is like there's a hole in the road.
What guarantee does your Section 2A of public-private partnerships tell me that you're trying to fill potholes?
I mean, it doesn't, modernizing infrastructure means modernizing existing
Thank you.
infrastructure.
Senator Dilip Kumar.
Modernizing doesn't mean expanding.
Senator, so when a road has a perception of having less traffic, are people more likely to use it?
Wait, can you repeat that?
Yeah, when a road has a perception of having less traffic, are people more likely to use it?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, so if that happens, don't you A, worsen traffic on that road, and B, decrease the use of public transportation?
No.
Why?
Because ultimately, if the traffic has a perception that there's less people on the road, then it probably has less people on the road. That's
right.
why
everybody thinks that the traffic increases.
Questioning time is allowed.
Right, and it loses that perception.
Senators, are there any motions on the floor? Senator Lytle.
Move the previous question.
Are there any seconds? Are there any opposed? Seeing none, we'll move to previous question. At this time, all those who wish to vote in favor of this infrastructure bill, please raise your placard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 8. All those who wish to fail this legislation. That's 4. With a vote of 8 to 4 to 0, this legislation does pass. Senator Lytle.
I move to recess until 2:30.
Are there any seconds? Are there any opposed? All right, seeing none, we'll move to recess until 2:30 p.m. Central Time. Thank you, everybody, for such a great first session.
Thank you for presiding.
No.
And thank you guys all for judging.
Students can go unless you have questions. Judges, I'm just supposed to remind you that, which you already know by now, to give the PO consideration and your rankings, and also give them 2 speech scores for their time here today. So yeah, I think we're good to go unless anyone has anything to add.
All right, see y'all then.
Thank you, Susan.